It was a quiet evening, and the lamps glowed faintly in the drawing room at Little Venice, where Lady Diana Cooper sat among the relics of her past. Photographs scattered upon the table caught the dim light, their silver frames holding faces that once laughed, once danced, once kissed the night with reckless abandon. Time had slowed for her, and yet within each picture she saw the unyielding flame of her youth, the fire that had carried her far from the life expected of her. It was here, in such a room, that memory mingled with silence, and the story of Diana, rebel aristocrat, might be told again, as though spoken not for her alone, but for all who wander the uncertain paths between duty and desire. Dearest listener, welcome. Before we wander through these corridors of memory, let me ask you to share in this weaving of time. Tell me in the comments when and where you are listening, so that we may form a tapestry of voices stretched across oceans and years, a quiet global network of remembrance. And if you wish to support this journey, gently press the subscribe button and let the tale continue its long, unbroken flow. She was born into grandeur and shadow, Diana Olivia Winifred Maud Manners, daughter of the 8th Duke of Rutland, and yet from the very beginning there clung to her the whispers of uncertainty. It is said in certain quiet corners of history that her true father might not have been the Duke, but the distinguished politician Harry Cust, a man whose charm and brilliance had captivated her mother Violet. Such whispers were never quite silenced, and even Diana herself, in the candor of her later memoirs, acknowledged the ambiguity with an almost mischievous acceptance. What does it mean, one wonders, to be born into doubt, to be marked at birth not only by privilege but also by speculation, a living question clothed in the trappings of certainty? Perhaps such beginnings explain why she would one day walk the path of rebellion, refusing to live neatly inside the gilded box that society prepared for her. Belvoir Castle, her childhood home, loomed upon the Leicestershire landscape with towers that seemed eternal. To walk within its halls was to breathe the weight of centuries, for each corridor echoed with footsteps of dukes and duchesses, long since dust. Diana as a child wandered there, sensing not only the opulence of her surroundings, but also the loneliness concealed beneath the grand stone. Rooms too vast for comfort can magnify silence, and corridors too long can stretch into corridors of thought. One imagines her small hands brushing against the cold walls, tracing lines that no one else noticed, whispering to herself in the hush that followed every departing servant's step. Beauty, wealth, title. All these she inherited, and yet within her heart was the restless desire for something unmeasured, something unseen. She was not a studious child in the strict sense, though her mind sparkled when it wished. Her education was, as with many aristocratic daughters, designed to shape a lady rather than a thinker. Yet what books she did touch stirred her. She lingered on poetry, on images of faraway lands, and on the lives of women who had slipped beyond ordinary boundaries. Her beauty was noticed early, described by many as startling, almost unearthly, and yet she herself bore it with an air of detachment, as though beauty were both blessing and burden. Is it not strange how beauty can open doors and yet close the deeper chambers of recognition? For when eyes are fixed upon the surface, who then dares to look within? Even as a girl, she may have sensed that the admiration directed at her was not wholly for herself, but for the symmetry of her features, the golden strands of her hair, the aristocratic line of her jaw. And so, though surrounded by admiration, she carried within her the suspicion that she was unseen. Perhaps this is the seed of her rebellion. For what does one do when the world sees only a mask, a portrait, a polished jewel? One tears away at the frame. One seeks a life that breaks the gaze and demands encounter with the living soul beneath. It is here, in these childhood years, that the faint murmur of resistance first began to stir in Diana's spirit, though neither she nor those around her could yet name it. Her mother, Violet, the Duchess of Rutland, was a force of her own, commanding, artistic, passionately involved in the lives of her children and her household. From her, Diana inherited both an appreciation for beauty and a refusal to accept mediocrity. Yet Violet's intensity was sometimes overwhelming, her expectations heavy. Diana was caught between admiration and resistance, loving her mother, yet refusing to be her mirror. And what of her father, the Duke? He was a figure of authority more than intimacy, embodying tradition, but distant, as though made of the same stone as Belvoir itself. To such a child, the castle became both cradle and cage. Privilege does not always soothe, sometimes it suffocates. The world into which she was born, Edwardian England, was itself a world on the brink of change. The great houses still glittered with wealth, but beyond their gates murmurs of social reform, new ideas and new freedoms were spreading. Diana would have seen both, the old world richly carved yet beginning to crack, and the faint outline of another world, not yet defined but pressing forward. Which side would she stand upon? Would she cling to the fading grandeur of her ancestors or step boldly into the unknown future? The answer, of course, we know. She chose the latter, though not in the loud political way of suffragettes or radicals, but in the subtle, deeply personal way of a woman refusing to conform to the roles carved for her. At gatherings in her youth, among her cousins and companions, she was already marked as different. Friends noted her wit, her sparkle, her disregard for conventional propriety. She was not content to sit quietly in lace and pearls, waiting to be admired. She spoke, she laughed, she challenged. And when others whispered that such behavior was unbecoming of a duke's daughter, she seemed not to hear. Or perhaps she heard and smiled, letting the disapproval serve as fuel for her independence. Some said she was wild. Others said she was free. Both were correct, though perhaps neither captured the full truth. There's a curious tension in these early years. She was both bound and unbound, bound by her heritage, by the heavy name of Rutland, by the duty that pressed upon her shoulders, and yet unbound in her spirit, already leaning toward the unknown, already restless beneath the weight of her title. It is in this tension that her story begins to unfold, a story not of rejecting her world entirely, but of reshaping it, bending its rules until they became bearable, even beautiful, in her own fashion. The child wandering the echoing halls of Belvoir would one day step into rooms filled not with portraits of ancestors, but with the laughter of poets, painters, politicians, and rebels. Yet already in those corridors of her youth, she was listening to silence, to whispers, to the secret song of freedom that only the restless can hear. And as the evening lamps flickered against the stone, perhaps she too flickered, a soul not yet aflame, but already preparing to burn brightly, dangerously, and beautifully. And so Part 1 closes with the image of a young girl standing in a vast candlelit hall, her eyes half in shadow, half in light, unsure of her place, but certain of her desire to choose it herself. The echo of her footsteps fades, but the question remains. What does it mean to be born into both certainty and doubt? And how does such a paradox shape the life to come? The child in the candlelit hall lingers still, her shadow stretched long upon the stone, as though it were another being walking beside her. That faint echo, half companion and half ghost, followed her through the chambers of Belvoir Castle, and as she grew, the castle itself became the silent witness to her awakening spirit. The air was thick with polish and tapestries, yet through the high windows one could glimpse the winds moving freely across the fields beyond, winds that whispered to her of escape, though she could not yet name what she wished to flee. It is in such contrasts that childhood impressions carve themselves deep into the soul. The weight of permanence against the lure of transience, the stone walls against the endless sky. Belvoir was not merely a residence, it was a stage set by history, every portrait on its walls pressing upon the young Diana with the stern reminder of legacy. Ancestors in gilt frames, their eyes unblinking, seemed to command her into obedience. And yet, even as she curtsied in parlors and practiced her deportment beneath the eye of tutors, she sensed that their world and her own were not aligned. The grand dining tables, where courses stretched long into candlelit evenings, were designed to display order, hierarchy, and continuity. But within Diana, disorder flickered. She laughed too freely, questioned too openly, and in those small rebellions, the old rhythms faltered. Can it be that rebellion begins not in acts of defiance, but in the quiet recognition that the room one is placed within does not quite belong? Her childhood was adorned with rituals that seemed ancient even then. Mornings were structured, the servants efficient, the meals predictable, the voices of authority constant. Yet between the schedules and lessons, she found her own pathways. She loved animals, often straying into the stables and gardens, where life felt less rehearsed. Horses, with their restless eyes, carried for her a kind of kindredness, for they too were creatures of both beauty and constraint. She would lean against their warm sides, listening to their breath, and perhaps in their quiet strength, she found an early mirror of her own restless vitality. The vast libraries of the castle, filled with volumes that many in her family scarcely touched, provided another escape. Though not driven by academic rigor, Diana dipped into stories and histories with a hunger not for detail, but for texture. She absorbed images more than arguments, atmospheres more than lessons. In this, she was less a scholar than a dreamer, gathering fragments that would one day surface in her own writing. A phrase, a tale of distant lands, a verse of poetry, they were enough to stir her. And is this not the essence of imagination? To live not in what is imposed, but in what seeps in, unbidden, like the wind through a half-open window? But if the castle offered her glimpses of freedom, it also bound her more tightly in the eyes of others. Guests who visited noted her extraordinary looks, even as a child. There was something arresting in the line of her face, the golden gleam of her hair, and the way her eyes carried both light and mischief. Relatives and acquaintances predicted she would be a beauty, and in their predictions lay expectations. She was to marry well, to adorn the lineage with her loveliness, to fulfill the unspoken contract of noble daughters. Yet such expectations felt like chains even before she could fully name them. To be admired is not always to be loved. To be anticipated is not always to be understood. How often must she have wondered, even then, whether she was being seen as Diana, or merely as the vessel of others' desires for continuity? Her mother Violet's presence in the household was both commanding and inspiring. Violet was artistic, passionate, fiercely opinionated, a duchess who loved not only the grandeur of her role, but also the creative shaping of her environment. The gardens, the interiors, the very atmosphere of Belvoir bore her touch. From her, Diana inherited a taste for beauty, for art, for a certain boldness of vision. Yet a mother's fire, when too close, can singe as much as it warms. Violet demanded excellence, demanded attention, demanded loyalty, and Diana, while admiring her mother, often resisted being drawn wholly into that orbit. Their bond was deep, but marked by the constant negotiation of two strong spirits, one seeking to mold, the other seeking to escape molding. The Duke, by contrast, was a quieter, sterner figure, a man of duty more than warmth. His presence reminded Diana of the obligations tied to her name, yet he too seemed somehow distant, a symbol of tradition rather than a companion of intimacy. Perhaps it was in this triangle, between her mother's intensity, her father's distance, and her own restless individuality, that Diana first discovered the art of performance. For to navigate such a household, one must learn when to charm, when to retreat, when to laugh, when to deflect. Already she was practicing, without knowing it, the subtle art of creating a persona, a skill that would one day carry her onto stages and into salons with equal brilliance. And beyond the family, beyond the castle walls, the wider world was shifting. Edwardian England, though outwardly stable, was rippling with undercurrents. Women's voices were rising in suffrage movements, new artistic forms were challenging old aesthetics, and the young, restless heirs of privilege were beginning to question the solemn traditions of their fathers. Diana grew within this ferment, absorbing it not from treatises but from the air itself, from conversations overheard, from the changes she could sense in the eyes of visiting friends. She was not a political creature in the formal sense, but she was attuned to the spirit of the age, and the spirit whispered to her that the old ways could not endure forever. Yet childhood, even for those destined to rebel, is also a time of innocence, of laughter, of moments that linger not because they signify rebellion, but because they are tender. She played with siblings, ran through the gardens, danced in the glow of summer afternoons, and for all her restlessness, she was also capable of joy. It is important to remember this, for too often lives of later fame are painted only in the colors of their defiance. Diana was more than her rebellion. She was also a child who delighted in small freedoms, who savored beauty wherever she found it, who laughed with abandon. And perhaps it is precisely this capacity for joy that made her defiance later so luminous. For rebellion without joy is bitterness, but rebellion with joy becomes art. As she approached adolescence, the tension between expectation and individuality deepened. Suitors and admirers began to hover, encouraged by families who saw in her not only beauty but also alliance, status, inheritance. The rituals of presentation, of balls and gatherings, loomed ahead, and Diana, though not yet openly defiant, carried within her a quiet knowledge that she would not follow these paths blindly. One can almost see her in the great hall again, but now older, standing at the threshold of society, the doors ready to open into a world of ritual and arrangement. The candles burn, the portraits look down, the air waits. Will she step forward as they wish, or will she turn aside? The sound of a door creaks faintly in the castle, and in that creak lies the question of her future. Beyond those doors lies society, with its rules, its expectations, its gaze fixed upon her beauty. Within the castle lies the weight of ancestry, pressing upon her shoulders. Between them she stands, a young woman poised upon the edge of decision, and the echo of her footsteps, once childlike, now carries the first note of independence. The door creaked and opened, and with it came the rush of society's gaze, a gaze that fell not upon the quiet child of Belvoir Castle, but upon the young woman she was becoming. No longer only a daughter moving unseen through corridors, Diana now stood in the light of drawing rooms and ballrooms, where chandeliers cast their crystal patterns across polished floors, and every glance seemed a judgment. It was here, beneath the shimmer of candles and the weight of expectation, that her beauty became both crown and chain. For those who beheld her saw not simply Diana, but an image, a vision, something to be admired, coveted, perhaps possessed, but rarely understood. There is a cruelty in beauty when it arrives too soon, when the features of a young face strike others like art long before the spirit within has been allowed to settle. Diana was praised, compared to angels, likened to visions from paintings, and yet how often must she have wondered what lay behind such words? Did they love her laughter, her wit, Her restlessness? Or did they only worship the symmetry of her cheek, the light in her hair, the easy elegance of her movements? Beauty can be a veil, and veils, however luminous, can hide the living soul beneath. In those first seasons of her coming out, society looked upon her as one of its brightest ornaments. Invitations multiplied, offers were whispered, alliances considered. Yet even in the height of admiration, Diana displayed an indifference that puzzled many. She laughed at the right moments, she shone when she chose, but she did not hunger for approval as others expected. Her gaze often drifted past the rituals, as though she were listening for something beyond the music of the violins, beyond the chatter of voices rehearsing the same patterns. In such moments, she seemed to carry within her a secret knowledge that life was larger than the ballroom, that a destiny awaited her beyond the narrowing corridors of aristocratic duty. Her beauty, described by some as ethereal, by others as unsettling, did not conform entirely to the fashions of her day. There was a wildness in her expression, an independence that resisted neat categorization. To see her was to be captivated, and yet to sense, perhaps uneasily, that she was not entirely yours to behold. Evelyn Waugh, who would later write of her with reverence, saw in her not only a figure of society but a muse, a spark of something untamed. It is in this way that beauty, when fused with spirit, ceases to be mere ornament and becomes instead a kind of rebellion. The more she was admired, the more she seemed to test the boundaries of that admiration. While other young women of her rank absorbed the lessons of modest presentation, Diana teased with wit, challenged with laughter, revealed opinions where silence was expected. Some found her daring, others improper, but none could ignore her. And is it not in such small, deliberate gestures that the seeds of greater defiance are sown? For one does not wake one morning and renounce an entire world. Rather, one learns to stretch the rules until they loosen, one remark at a time, one gesture at a time, until the chains of expectation are thinned by practice. Yet this defiance was not bitterness. It was not the rebellion of anger, but the rebellion of joy. Diana was alive to the pleasures of the moment, to the intoxication of laughter, to the thrill of companionship. In gatherings, her voice carried lightness, her laughter a kind of music that invited others to cast off their stiffness. To be in her company was to be lifted for a moment above the heaviness of propriety. But in this gift lay a deeper danger to society's order, for joy that refuses to be confined can unravel traditions more thoroughly than argument or protest. One remembers accounts of her appearing at parties, her dress a little more daring, her remarks a little more mischievous, her behavior a touch too free for the guardians of decorum. She was not vulgar nor reckless beyond repair, but she stepped always slightly beyond the line, enough to startle, enough to remind those watching that she could not be fully contained. Admirers were drawn to her for this very reason. She was both of their world and against it, a duke's daughter who refused to behave like one, a beauty who mocked the very pedestal on which she was placed. But beneath the laughter and charm, a question persisted. What did beauty mean to her? Did she feel pride, or was it more often a burden? When one's face is celebrated before one's words are listened to, does it not create a shadow of doubt? Perhaps this is why she sometimes seemed aloof, her eyes distant even in the midst of conversation. For while others feasted on her image, she was searching for something else: connection, recognition, truth. And how rarely she must have found it in the gaze of suitors who spoke of her loveliness more than her soul. At home, this duality pressed upon her still more heavily. Her mother urged her toward brilliance, her father embodied duty, and society whispered of advantageous matches. Yet Diana resisted the narrowing of choice. When proposals came, some glittering with title and fortune, she dismissed them with startling ease. Friends marveled, families whispered, but Diana remained unmoved. It was not that she rejected love, but that she would not allow love to be dictated. She would not be bartered, not even in velvet wrappings. Such refusals, small though they seemed, were radical in her world, for they announced that beauty would not be a currency in her hands, but rather a tool she herself might wield as she chose. The years of her youth passed in this rhythm of admiration and quiet rebellion. She was courted by dukes, adored by artists, celebrated by society, and yet she moved through it with the grace of one who knew she was not entirely of it. Her destiny was not to be the ornament of another man's household, nor the quiet duchess presiding over duties. Something else awaited, though she could not yet see its full shape. What she knew was only this: she would not be confined. The image lingers of Diana in her early 20s, standing in a garden after an evening of dancing, the air cool upon her shoulders, the music faint behind her, the stars bright above the castle towers. Admirers drift indoors, laughter fades, but she remains outside, gazing upward. In her beauty there is defiance, in her silence a question. What lies beyond these towers, beyond these rituals, beyond this role? She does not yet know the answer, but the asking itself is a beginning. And so, the night deepens. The candles burn lower, the ballroom grows still. Within the castle, portraits rest unchanged upon the walls. Outside, the wind stirs the trees, carrying a scent of freedom. Diana closes her eyes, and for a moment she is not the admired debutante, not the Duke's daughter, but simply a young woman listening to the promise of the world beyond. The garden air lingered cool upon her skin, the stars scattered like distant lamps across the velvet sky, and in that stillness, Diana understood that she could never be only what society wished her to be. When she stepped back inside the castle halls, the air was heavy with candle smoke and the echoes of laughter already fading, and she knew those rituals would never suffice. To return again and again to such rooms, to play the same role endlessly, would be to silence the voice she barely dared to name. Thus began her quiet rejection of aristocratic duty, not with grand declarations, but with subtle refusals, with choices that unsettled the careful architecture of her world. For a daughter of the Duke, the path was clearly laid. She would marry suitably, preside gracefully, produce heirs, and maintain the continuity of rank. But Diana, with her restless wit and her keen sense of self, would not fit into such a mold. Suitors came, suitors went, some bearing illustrious titles, others immense fortunes, yet none ignited in her the spark of recognition. She dismissed them with a charm that disguised her resolve, and each refusal rang like a soft note of rebellion within the corridors of Belvoir. Was it scandalous? Perhaps not yet, but it was dangerous in its quiet way, for it hinted that she would not allow her life to be arranged like the placement of porcelain upon a polished table. Her refusal was not merely personal, it was emblematic of a shifting time. The early 20th century trembled with the first great movements of women beyond the confines of tradition. Suffragettes clashed with policemen in the streets of London, pamphlets flew, voices shouted, and though Diana herself was no marcher with banners, the spirit of freedom was in the very air she breathed. She did not need to join the cause publicly. Her life itself, the choices she made, became a kind of private protest against the limitations of her sex and her station. In her laughter at propriety, in her disdain for carefully arranged alliances, she enacted in miniature what others fought for in the streets. Her mother Violet, fierce and opinionated, did not always understand this resistance. For Violet, duty and beauty were not opposites. They were intertwined. A woman might adorn tradition and still exercise power within it. But Diana looked elsewhere. She sought not to adorn, but to escape. Not to decorate the cage, but to step beyond its bars. Between them, mother and daughter, The tension grew, a tension of two strong wills facing different horizons. Violet's fire, though inherited, was transmuted in Diana into something freer, less tied to the castle and its history, more attuned to the yet unshaped world beyond. Even in her circle of friends, Diana stood apart. She was surrounded by young men and women of her class, many of them dutifully rehearsing the roles expected of them. But she listened to new voices too, the poets, the artists, the restless spirits who dared to question whether the old order could truly last. When she laughed with them, when she exchanged her sharp remarks and dazzling wit, she revealed that she was not aligned with the staid traditions of her ancestors, but with the shimmer of something more fluid, more daring. It was around this time that she began to move into the orbit of those who would later be called the bright young things. Though the term had not yet been coined, they were a generation marked by war's shadow and peace's intoxication, children of privilege who found the old solemnities empty and instead embraced glittering nights of laughter, masquerades, and careless adventure. Diana was not merely among them, she was their muse, their queen, the figure around whom their revels seemed to crystallize. She had crossed the threshold from aristocratic duty into a world of chosen freedom, a freedom that expressed itself not in slogans, but in nights of champagne and mornings of recklessness. Yet such freedom was never without its cost. The guardians of tradition looked upon her with disapproval. Whispers circulated that she was wild, that she was unbecoming, that she shamed her family by refusing to play her part. But Diana wore such whispers as lightly as one might wear a veil in the wind. She seemed to draw energy from defiance itself, as though every note of scandal only confirmed that she was living authentically, not as a daughter of lineage, but as a creature of her own making. And still, in the midst of laughter and rebellion, she carried a seriousness beneath the surface. Her wit was bright, but it was sharpened by intelligence. Her laughter was free, but it was grounded in awareness. She understood that the world was changing, that the war which had torn Europe had left behind not only grief, but also a hunger for life, for renewal, for rebellion against the old. She was both participant and symbol of this shift, a woman who embodied the new spirit even as she inherited the old name. One wonders, did she ever pause in those years to question her path? Did she, in moments of solitude, feel the pull of the traditional role, the temptation to retreat into the safety of conformity? Perhaps she did. For rebellion is not a straight line, but a series of choices, each one carrying its own cost. But if she hesitated, she never yielded. She pressed forward, laughing, dancing, living, refusing to be bound by the invisible chains others sought to lay upon her. The contrast between the castle and the city grew ever sharper. At Belvoir, the walls pressed with history. In London, the nights opened wide with possibility. And Diana chose London, chose the laughter, chose the uncertain freedom over the certain confinement. The rituals of her ancestors became to her like museum pieces, admired perhaps, but not to be lived in. Instead, she wove her own rituals, the gatherings of friends, the smoky rooms where poetry was recited and champagne spilled, the wild drives in motor cars beneath the night sky. These were her ceremonies, and in them she felt alive. But rebellion, even joyful rebellion, carries a haunting question. How long can it last? Can beauty defy duty forever? Can laughter hold back the tide of tradition, or will the world demand its price in time? Diana herself could not yet know, for now she lived in the radiance of her defiance, her beauty shining, her wit cutting, her freedom intoxicating. The future was a door still closed, and she chose not to worry about its locks. And so the image remains, Diana at a gathering, laughter spilling around her, eyes drawn to her brilliance, whispers rising in admiration, and scandal alike. She stands in the glow, not as the Duke's daughter fulfilling duty, but as Diana herself, radiant and unbound. The music plays, glasses clink, and somewhere in the distance the faint chime of midnight rings out, reminding all that even the brightest night must fade. Yet for now, she dances, unconcerned with tomorrow, alive in the rebellion of the moment. The faint chime of midnight lingered in the air, and as the echo faded, it seemed to open into another world entirely. A world not of duty and tradition, but of wild invention, of nights that dissolved into dawn, of spirits determined to live as though each moment were a rebellion against gravity itself. This was the world of the bright young things, that curious constellation of artists, aristocrats, and dreamers who rose in the aftermath of war to make life itself into a performance. Diana, with her beauty and her wit, her refusal to conform, and her hunger for delight, moved among them like a star around which others revolved. The gatherings were unlike anything their elders could sanction. Rooms filled with smoke and laughter, champagne flowing as though it were water, costumes donned not for ceremony but for play. One might stumble upon a midnight picnic on the steps of a church, or a masked ball in a crumbling house, or a motor car hurtling through the countryside as though speed itself were a form of freedom. These were not mere parties. They were declarations, rituals of their own kind, a refusal to live in the gray shadow of tradition. Diana was not always the organizer, but wherever she appeared, the night seemed to quicken, to acquire a sharper brilliance. Her friends adored her, not only for her looks, which remained the subject of endless remarks, but for her spirit. She laughed without restraint, spoke with candor, and carried herself with a lightness that seemed to challenge the solemnity of the past. Evelyn Waugh would later immortalize such nights in his novels, their satire sharp yet tinged with nostalgia, and Diana was never far from his imagination. For him, as for others, she was both symbol and reality, the embodiment of a generation that refused to bow its head to the weight of grief and instead chose to crown itself with revelry. Yet within these nights of delight lay shadows, for the bright young things were, in part, children of war. They had seen, or at least felt, the great cataclysm that had shaken Europe, and they knew that the old certainties had died upon the battlefields. In their laughter, there was an undertone of mourning, in their recklessness, a defiance of mortality. Diana, too, must have sensed this, though she cloaked it in gaiety. To live so brightly was not only to celebrate life, but also to mock death, to insist that beauty and joy could endure even in a broken world. There were scandals, of course, whispers of impropriety, of excess, of waste. The newspapers feasted on their antics, delighting in tales of aristocratic youths wasting fortunes in a single evening, of young women smoking, drinking, dancing with abandon. Diana's name appeared often, sometimes praised, sometimes condemned, but always noticed. And yet, unlike many who fell into caricature, she retained a kind of grace that shielded her. However wild the stories, she emerged from them not diminished, but burnished, as though her very refusal to be shamed was itself a kind of protection. She was more than a reveler. She was also a companion of artists and thinkers. In the same drawing rooms where champagne spilled, conversations turned to poetry, to art, to the strange new modern age unfolding. Diana listened, laughed, contributed, her presence as vital to such exchanges as it was to the dances and games. She inspired not only admiration but creativity, for around her gathered those who sought to capture in words or paint the elusive shimmer of her spirit. In this way, she became not simply part of the bright young things, but their emblem, their muse, the figure who seemed to crystallize their longing to live differently. But what did it mean for her, personally, to inhabit this role? Was she always at ease, or did she sometimes feel herself trapped in another form of expectation, the expectation now not of tradition but of rebellion? To be the muse of a generation can be as confining as to be the dutiful daughter of a duke. Did she ever wonder whether the laughter was another mask, whether the wild nights were another kind of cage, albeit one adorned with glitter and song? Perhaps she did, though if so, she rarely revealed it. Her public face remained luminous, her private doubts, if they existed, hidden in the quiet corners of her heart. It is easy, with the distance of years, to romanticize the bright young things, to see only the sparkle and not the exhaustion, the brilliance and not the emptiness that sometimes followed. Diana lived both. She delighted in the nights of freedom, yet she also carried within her a seriousness that distinguished her from some of her companions. She knew that such revels could not last forever, that life would demand other forms of courage. And in time she would indeed turn to new stages, both literal and metaphorical, to continue her rebellion in different ways. For now, though, in those golden years of the 1920s, she shone. She was seen racing through the streets in motor cars, appearing at masked balls in gowns that startled, laughing in smoky rooms where poets argued and artists sketched. She was whispered about, written about, adored, criticized, envied, but above all, she was alive, fully alive, in a way that few dared to be. To watch her was to feel the pulse of an age that refused to bow to solemnity. To know her was to glimpse a spirit that could not be bound by title, by duty, by tradition. The image remains vivid. Diana in a crowded room, smoke curling above, glasses clinking, voices rising in laughter. She leaned slightly forward, her eyes bright, her words quick, her beauty undeniable, yet not her sole claim to brilliance. Around her, the bright young things swirl in their ceaseless dance, but she stands at the center, not because she seeks the role, but because she cannot help but occupy it. She is the flame around which the moths circle, the figure who makes the night seem brighter simply by her presence. And yet, as the laughter swells, as the champagne fizzes, as the music rises, there is also a pause, a fleeting, nearly invisible pause, in which her gaze drifts away from the room, away from the revels, towards some horizon only she can see. In that moment, one senses that she is already searching for the next path, the next form of defiance, the next stage on which to test her independence. The revels cannot last forever, and perhaps she knows it already. But for now, she smiles, she lifts her glass, and the room erupts once more in delight, unaware of the question lingering behind her eyes. The night deepens, and outside the revelers' laughter, the city waits, its streets silent, its lamplight casting long shadows. The motor cars are ready, the masks are tied, the champagne flows, and Diana steps into the stream of youth unafraid. But somewhere beyond the laughter, the faint sound of a curtain being drawn whispers of a different stage awaiting her. A stage not of smoky rooms, but of theater lights, where rebellion will take yet another form. The curtain whispered as it drew across the stage, and in that faint sound lay the promise of another kind of freedom, a freedom not of champagne laughter or motor cars rushing through London's midnight streets, but of illusion and creation, of words and gestures brought to life beneath the gaze of strangers. Diana, who had already defied the expectations of her birth by refusing to submit to arranged alliances, now chose a path that scandalized her world still further. She would become an actress. For the daughter of a duke to step upon the stage was almost unthinkable, a trespass into a realm long considered unsuitable for those of high lineage. The theater belonged, in the eyes of society, to professionals, to outsiders, even to the disreputable. But Diana, restless and radiant, saw in its glow not disgrace, but possibility. To act was to transform, to inhabit other lives, to slip for a moment beyond the rigid boundaries of class and duty. She had already learned in the drawing rooms and the ballrooms the art of performance, of laughter timed to charm, of wit sharpened to unsettle, but the stage offered her a new canvas. There she could become not only herself, but anyone, a queen, a lover, a tragic heroine, a figure drawn from the imagination. And perhaps, beneath the guise of performance, she could reveal more truth than any ball or banquet had ever allowed. Her choice caused murmurs, of course. More than murmurs, outright disapproval. Relatives shook their heads, acquaintances whispered behind gloved hands, the newspapers hinted at scandal. Was it fitting, they asked, for Lady Diana Manners, daughter of the Duke of Rutland, to appear on stage before paying audiences, to be looked upon as an object of entertainment? Yet Diana, with her serene confidence, did not falter. She understood that scandal was another kind of performance, and she wore it with the same elegance with which she wore her gowns. If society was shocked, so be it. She would not retreat. Her first roles were not in the great theaters of London, but in productions tied to war relief and charitable causes. During the Great War, when England reeled with loss, Diana joined with others in performances meant to raise spirits and funds. It was here that her presence first dazzled audiences, not only for her beauty but for the sincerity of her performance. She was not merely ornamental, she was captivating. Critics, even those inclined to dismiss her for her birth, admitted that she possessed a natural stage presence, a voice that carried, a magnetism that held the eye. From these beginnings, she moved deeper into the world of acting. The stage drew her, but so too did the new art of cinema. In silent films she appeared, her face luminous upon the screen, her movements conveying emotion with a subtlety that words could not capture. There is something haunting in the thought of her image flickering upon those early reels, larger than life, projected in darkened halls where strangers sat transfixed. For one whose beauty had always been both crown and burden, cinema was both gift and paradox. It immortalized her features, making them visible to thousands, yet it also risked reducing her again to an image, a vision, a figure admired but not fully known. Did she wonder, sitting in the dark, seeing her own face cast upon the screen, whether she had escaped or merely deepened the cage? And yet, she pressed on. Acting was not a retreat, but a continuation of her rebellion. For every role she played was another refusal to be confined by the destiny chosen for her. On stage, she was not the Duke's daughter, but a woman among others, judged not by her lineage, but by her ability to move an audience. She reveled in the discipline of rehearsal, in the camaraderie of the troupe, in the electric moment when the curtain rose and silence fell. The theater demanded vulnerability, and she gave it. It demanded strength, and she gave that too. Those who knew her then spoke of the transformation that occurred when she stepped into character. She seemed to shed her aristocratic aura, to inhabit fully the lives of those she portrayed. And yet, even in disguise, her essence shone through, the wit, the intelligence, the independence. Perhaps that is the paradox of acting. To disappear into another, one must first know oneself. Diana, who had always resisted being merely an image, used the stage to reveal fragments of her truer self, hidden beneath layers of expectation. But what did society make of this new Diana? Some never accepted it. To them, her career was a flirtation with the improper, a dalliance unbecoming of her rank. Others, particularly the younger generation, admired her courage. They saw in her a symbol of freedom, a woman unafraid to live on her own terms. To step upon the stage was, for her, not only an artistic choice, but a declaration. I will not be defined by the name I was given, nor by the role others demand. I will define myself. Her time in theater and film was not without its struggles. She was not, in the technical sense, among the greatest actresses of her age. Critics praised her presence but sometimes questioned her range. Yet to measure her by such standards is to miss the point. Her career was not about mastery of craft alone, but about the daring it embodied. Each performance was a gesture of defiance, a reminder that she lived according to her own design. And for audiences, even those skeptical of her talent, the sheer fact of her presence carried weight. To see Lady Diana Cooper upon the stage was to witness the breaking of a barrier, the collapse of a tradition. The curtain falls, the applause rises, and for a moment, she stands there, bathed in the glow of admiration, not because she is a duke's daughter, not because she is beautiful, but because she has dared. That moment, fleeting yet profound, encapsulates her rebellion. She bows, she smiles, and somewhere in her heart she knows that this applause is different, more genuine than the murmured compliments of society's drawing rooms. Here, at least, she is applauded for her choice, not for her inheritance. And yet, as with every chapter of her life, questions linger. Did she truly find freedom on the stage? Or was it another form of performance, another mask worn to protect the restless soul within? Did the audience see Diana, or only the character she played, or only the luminous beauty projected upon their imaginations? Perhaps the answer lies in the space between, in the brief moments when she broke through the illusion and revealed herself, unguarded, luminous, not because she was admired, but because she was alive. Outside the theater, the city continued its restless hum. Lights glowed in windows, motor cars rattled on cobblestones, and in private rooms, friends gathered to speak of art and politics, of war and peace. Diana, shedding her costume, would rejoin them, half actress, half aristocrat, half rebel, never wholly one thing or another. The curtain's whisper still clung to her, as though reminding her that the stage was but one chapter, and that other stages, less literal but no less demanding, awaited. And so we leave her there for now, stepping out into the London night after a performance. The scent of grease paint still faint upon her skin, the applause echoing faintly in her ears. Around her the city murmurs, alive with possibility, and ahead, though she does not yet see it, waits a figure who will change her path again. A diplomat, a writer, a man who will share her life in love and in scandal, in loyalty and in loss. His name is Duff Cooper, and already in the shadows of the theater's exit, destiny draws nearer. The theater doors closed behind her, the night air cool upon her face, and there in the half-light of London's restless streets stood the figure who would soon entwine his destiny with hers. Duff Cooper, diplomat, writer, charmer, and man of undeniable magnetism, was waiting, not in the sense of standing in her path at that precise moment, but waiting in life, waiting in fate, waiting in the pattern of her story. Their meeting had already occurred, their acquaintance already begun, but in the great arc of her journey, it was as if on that night he stepped forward from the shadow into the glow of her path. Duff was not the suitor her family might have chosen. He lacked the lofty title of a duke, the ancient lineage of a great house, the immense fortune that tradition demanded. He was clever, ambitious, possessed of charm that could disarm and delight, but he was not, in the eyes of Violet the Duchess, a match for her brilliant daughter. Yet Diana, who had dismissed so many suitors gilded with wealth and rank, saw in Duff something else. A spirit alive, a wit as sharp as her own, a man who dared to speak as though he were her equal. And in that daring, she recognized something of herself, for she, too, had spent her life refusing to be diminished. Their courtship, if it may be called that, was never simple. Gossip circled them, doubts clouded them, and resistance rose against them. But Diana was resolute. For once she was not indifferent, not dismissive, not merely amused. She was moved, and when she chose with finality. Against her mother's disapproval, against society's raised brows, she gave herself to Duff. It was not only love, though love was surely there. It was also a continuation of her rebellion. To marry not for alliance, not for fortune, but for passion and conviction was itself a defiance of her class. Their wedding in 1919 was both celebrated and whispered about. Some saw it as a misstep, others as a scandal, but for Diana it was liberation. She had not been bartered, she had chosen. And in that choice she found not confinement, but expansion. For with Duff came a life of politics, diplomacy, and literature, a world far broader than the narrow corridors of Belvoir or the glittering but shallow revels of her youth. Together they would move through embassies and salons, through drawing rooms and battlefields of conversation, shaping not only their own story, but the story of their nation in its turbulent century. Yet love, even when freely chosen, is never free of shadows. Duff, brilliant and restless, was not a man of simple fidelities. His infidelities were known, sometimes whispered, sometimes open, and Diana, though wounded, did not abandon him. She loved him with a depth that endured betrayal, forgave him with a generosity that puzzled others, and bound herself to him not because he was flawless, but because he was hers. He was unfaithful, but he never ceased to love me, she would later say, and in that paradox lies the truth of their marriage, painful, imperfect, enduring. What does it mean to forgive so much, to endure so much for the sake of love? Some judged her, some pitied her, some admired her. But Diana's strength was not in denying reality, it was in embracing it fully. She knew what Duff was, and she chose to remain. Perhaps she saw in his brilliance and his weakness the same complexity she carried in herself. Perhaps she understood that love is not always tidy, that loyalty is not always unbroken, and that devotion sometimes takes the form of staying when others would leave. Together they became a couple, both admired and notorious. He with his political career rising to prominence as a conservative statesman, eloquent and daring in speech. She, dazzling in salons, admired by artists and intellectuals, a hostess whose drawing rooms became stages of influence. They complemented and complicated one another, their lives a dance of loyalty and freedom, of brilliance and scandal. Where others saw contradiction, they saw life. For theirs was not a union of perfection, but of energy, of force, of two spirits unwilling to settle into dullness. It was during these years that Diana's reputation as more than a socialite truly solidified. She was not merely a wife at her husband's side, but a force in her own right. Her charm, her wit, her beauty, her independence made her indispensable in the circles where politics and culture met. Ambassadors, writers, ministers, and artists alike found themselves drawn to her. She could disarm with a remark, illuminate a room with her laughter, and hold her own in conversation with the sharpest minds. To watch her was to see a woman who had made her own role, not given but claimed. And yet, one must not imagine her life as only salons and admiration. There were nights of solitude, of doubt, of sorrow at Duff's wanderings. There were the strains of diplomacy, the demands of appearances, the weight of being constantly observed. She bore these with the resilience she had carried from childhood, the resilience of one who had always walked a little apart from what was expected. She did not crumble, she endured, and in enduring she shaped herself anew. Their marriage, for all its turbulence, was also a partnership of creation. They encouraged one another's ambitions, supported one another's endeavors. Duff wrote, Diana acted, and later wrote as well. Together they wove a life that was larger than either might have made alone. He rose in politics, she rose in society and culture, And though the shadows never disappeared, neither did the light. They lived in the paradox fully, unashamed, unapologetic. It is in this paradox that the beauty of their story lies. For what is a perfect marriage but a fiction, a stage play with rehearsed lines? Diana and Duff's marriage was instead like life itself, untidy, painful, joyous, luminous, shadowed. And perhaps that is why it endured, why it fascinates still. For in their flaws, as much as their brilliance, they revealed something deeply human. Imagine them together, in a quiet room after an evening of conversation and wine. Duff, speaking rapidly, full of ideas, his hands moving as though to capture thoughts in the air. Diana watching him, amused, affectionate, weary perhaps, but present, always present. The lamp glows, the hour is late, and beyond the windows the city sleeps. They do not need to speak of fidelity or betrayal, of love or loss. They live it in all its complexity, in all its contradiction. And so their story moves forward, not toward resolution, but toward expansion. For with Duff, Diana's life would take her beyond the stages of London, beyond the salons of the bright young things, into the embassies of Paris, the corridors of power, the gatherings where history itself was shaped. The curtain had lifted on a new act, one in which she was not merely rebel or actress, but partner to a man whose career would entangle them in the very heart of 20th century politics. The night deepens once more, and the echo of the theater is replaced by the murmur of diplomatic voices, by the sound of foreign boulevards, by the shifting light of cities beyond England. Diana, no longer only Lady Manners, no longer only the actress, is now Lady Diana Cooper, diplomat's wife, hostess, muse, rebel still. The stage has widened, and upon it she will continue to play her own part with the same unyielding independence that had carried her from Belvoir's halls to the bright salons of London. The lamps of London dimmed behind them, and the sound of voices in familiar salons faded into memory. Ahead stretched a new landscape, one where the language of conversation changed, where the streets themselves seemed to breathe history with every step. Paris awaited them, that city of light and exile, of boulevards lined with trees and cafes, humming with argument, laughter, and song. For Diana and Duff, the move was not merely geographical, but spiritual. For in Paris, they entered a world where the rigid hierarchies of English society loosened, where the circles of culture and politics mingled with a freedom unknown in Belgravia, drawing rooms. Paris in the 20s was a crossroads, a gathering place for those who had survived war and sought renewal in art and thought. Exiled Russians, weary Americans, restless English, poets, painters, dancers, politicians, all found in its cafes and salons a stage upon which to test new identities. To walk its streets was to brush against history in motion. Diana, whose life had already been a rebellion against confinement, entered this world as though it were her natural home. Her beauty, her wit, her independence, all shone more freely in a city where eccentricity was not merely tolerated but admired. With Duff engaged in his diplomatic duties, Diana became at once a figure of fascination in Parisian society. The salons she hosted drew writers and thinkers, ambassadors and artists. Within her rooms, the scent of tobacco mingled with the sound of argument, laughter with the scratch of a pen. She was both hostess and participant, her presence not ornamental but essential. Where others presided stiffly, Diana enlivened. She asked, she challenged, she provoked, her questions sometimes more revealing than speeches. Guests left not only charmed but stirred, for in her company one felt not the weight of obligation, but the lift of curiosity. Among those who entered her circle were men and women who would define the cultural spirit of the age. Writers like Evelyn Waugh, who continued to find inspiration in her, and artists who sought to capture her likeness. Statesmen, too, recognized her influence. For though she held no office, her ability to charm and to connect softened conversations, bridged divides, and created spaces in which diplomacy was made human. Some even whispered that her presence in Parisian society advanced Duff's career as much as his own skill. For doors opened not only to the diplomat, but to the couple, and above all to the woman whose charisma transformed gatherings into events. But Paris was not only about salons and embassies. It was about wandering the boulevards, sitting at cafes as the city's rhythm unfolded. Diana absorbed it with all her senses: the taste of bitter coffee in the morning, the sight of lovers strolling beneath chestnut trees, the murmur of a violin drifting from a street corner. These details, insignificant perhaps to others, entered her memory and nourished her spirit. For Diana, beauty was not a luxury but a necessity, and Paris offered it endlessly. Yet even here, in this city of freedom, shadows lingered. Duff's infidelities did not cease with their change of address. Paris, with its air of license, perhaps encouraged them. Diana, though wounded, remained steadfast. Her loyalty was both strength and torment, her endurance both admired and misunderstood. She lived not in denial but in acceptance, a paradoxical acceptance that allowed her to remain whole. She chose to see in Duff not only his failings but his brilliance, and perhaps she knew, with a wisdom few possess, that love is rarely pure, rarely unbroken. The world around them, too, was shadowed. Europe between wars was not at rest. The memory of destruction lingered, and the foreboding of new storms could already be sensed. Conversations at her salons often turned to politics, to questions of stability, of nationalism, of peace. Diana listened, contributed, observed. She was not a politician, yet her presence made politics less abstract. In her drawing rooms, ideas were not merely debated but embodied, for here stood a woman who had herself crossed boundaries, who had defied conventions, who had chosen her own path. In her life, as in the city, tradition and modernity coexisted uneasily. There is a picture, vivid though unrecorded. Diana walking along the Seine at dusk, the lamps reflected in the water, the sound of laughter from a nearby cafe. Her steps slow, her thoughts distant. She is neither entirely content nor entirely restless, but poised in that liminal state where beauty and melancholy intertwine. She has everything, yet she seeks more. Not more in wealth or position, but more in meaning, in truth. Perhaps this is why she drew so many to her, because behind her radiance lay a searching soul, and to encounter her was to feel one's own searching stirred. Paris was also a place of masks. The exiles who filled its cafes wore masks of gaiety to cover loss. The artists masked hunger with brilliance. The politicians masked fragility with speeches. Diana, too, wore her mask, the mask of serenity, of lightness, of unshakable charm. Yet beneath it, moments of solitude revealed her vulnerability. Letters she wrote during these years speak of weariness, of longing, of love and its costs. She was no mere goddess of salons. She was a woman who felt deeply, who endured quietly, who carried within her both radiance and sorrow. Still, it was in Paris that her legend deepened. She was not only the rebel aristocrat, not only the actress turned hostess, but a figure whose presence seemed to embody the spirit of an age of defiance, of creativity, of instability. She lived at the intersection of politics and art, of love and loss, of tradition and rebellion. In her, others saw both the continuity of elegance and the rupture of modernity. And she, perhaps, saw in herself the same, a woman of the past, yet always leaning toward the future. The days passed, the years moved, and in time the gaiety of Paris dimmed as the shadows of conflict lengthened once more. For Diana and Duff, Paris was not the end but a chapter of brilliance and of contradictions, of beauty and of sorrow. When they left, they carried with them not only memories of salons and boulevards, but the sense that the world was shifting, that their roles would soon be demanded in ways neither had yet imagined. The image fades. Diana standing in a Parisian salon, her gown shimmering in lamplight, her laughter rising above the murmur of voices, her eyes bright yet thoughtful. Around her, the air is filled with conversation, with smoke, with the faint strains of music from a piano. Outside, the city waits, restless, beautiful, wounded, alive. And beyond the city, beyond the laughter, the thunder of war gathers once more, distant but unmistakable. The distant thunder that once seemed to murmur beyond the boulevards of Paris grew steadily louder until it filled the skies of Europe, and the gaiety of salons gave way to the solemnity of war. Diana and Duff returned to London, a city already bracing itself for the storm. The streets that had once echoed with motor cars and laughter now shook beneath the drone of aircraft. The glitter of chandeliers gave way to the dim glow of blackout curtains. Yet even here, in the heart of danger, Diana's life did not retreat into silence. She carried with her not only the memories of Parisian nights, but also the strength to confront a city under siege. And in doing so, she revealed another dimension of her rebellion, the ability to turn glamour into resilience, charm into courage, and presence into comfort for others. London in wartime was unlike any city she had ever known. Its rhythm was broken by sirens, its nights shattered by searchlights crisscrossing the sky, its mornings marked by rubble where houses had stood only hours before. Yet the people endured, and among them Diana endured with them. She did not retreat to safety, nor did she hide her life in private estates. Instead, she walked the streets, appeared at gatherings, visited shelters, and lent her presence to the morale of those who feared the next siren's call. Her beauty, once the subject of endless admiration in ballrooms and salons, became in these years a kind of symbol, a reminder that not all radiance had been extinguished by war. There is a paradox in beauty during destruction. One might expect it to be resented, mocked as frivolous amidst suffering. But in Diana's case, it became a balm, a reminder that life itself still contained grace. When she appeared at events, elegantly dressed but unafraid of the dangers around her, people felt lifted, reminded that the world they fought for was not only survival, but also the preservation of joy, of style, of human dignity. In the midst of rationing and rubble, her presence carried a message. That beauty and spirit could endure even when bombs fell. Her role was not official in the sense of rank or duty, but it was profound nonetheless. She was a hostess still, but her gatherings now bore a different purpose. Ministers, soldiers, writers, and friends gathered in her rooms not for frivolity, but for solace. Conversations turned to war strategy, to loss, to the fragile hope of victory. Yet even in such heavy times, she infused the air with her lightness, her wit, her refusal to sink into despair. She understood instinctively that morale was as vital as armaments, and that to sustain the human spirit was itself a form of service. Duff, by then a prominent figure in government, was deeply engaged in the political struggles of the war. His voice was raised in speeches, his hand present in decisions, and Diana stood beside him, not as a silent consort, but as a partner who carried her own influence. Ministers who visited their home knew that the conversation would not be complete without her, that she would challenge, question, and illuminate. Her independence of thought, her refusal to flatter, made her respected even among those who dismissed other hostesses as mere ornaments. Diana was never ornamental. She was essential. Yet the war touched her personally too. Friends were lost, houses destroyed, familiar streets transformed into wastelands of stone and smoke. Nights were broken by the wail of sirens, days by the sight of rubble. In such moments, even her resilience must have faltered. Letters and memoirs from this time reveal glimpses of weariness, of sorrow, of the heavy toll of endurance. But she did not yield. If she cried, she also laughed. If she mourned, she also lifted others. Her rebellion against despair was perhaps her most courageous act, for to refuse hopelessness in the face of destruction requires more strength than any party, any performance. There is an image often recalled of Diana during these years, standing in a shelter after a raid, speaking with those gathered, her voice calm, her presence reassuring. She did not need to make speeches or promises. Her very being was enough. In her laughter, people heard defiance of the bombs. In her elegance, they saw that life had not been wholly stripped of its color. What greater gift can one offer in times of darkness than the reminder that light endures? The theater, which had once been her rebellion, now returned to her in another form. She participated in wartime broadcasts, in performances meant to sustain the nation's spirit. Her voice carried across the airwaves, reaching those huddled in shelters, reminding them that they were not alone. Once she had been accused of scandal for stepping upon a stage. Now she was celebrated for using her stagecraft in service of the nation. The paradox delighted her, for it showed how rebellion, once condemned, could become essential when times demanded it. In her salons, the war intruded constantly. Winston Churchill, a family friend, sometimes appeared, his presence larger than life, his words thunderous even in private. Others, too, politicians, generals, writers, came and went. Diana conversed with them not as a spectator, but as one engaged, her questions probing, her remarks sharp. She was not afraid to disagree, and those who underestimated her because of her beauty quickly learned their error. In war as in peace, she remained herself, a woman who could not be confined to silence or to role. And yet, amidst this seriousness, she never abandoned glamour. She dressed elegantly even when clothes were rationed. She walked with poise even when streets were cratered. Some may have seen this as vanity, but those who understood saw it differently. Glamour was her form of defiance, her declaration that destruction would not strip the world of its grace. In this, she was like the city itself, scarred but unbowed, diminished but radiant. The war dragged on year after weary year, and through it all she endured. She was not a soldier. She did not command armies, but she fought in her own way by refusing to let despair become the final word. For those around her, her rebellion against hopelessness was as vital as the speeches of ministers or the strategies of generals. And when victory finally came, when the bombs ceased and the streets began to heal, Diana too emerged, altered yet unbroken, her spirit intact, her legend deepened. The image remains, Diana stepping out of a shelter after a night of bombing, the morning sky gray, the city smoldering, her face calm, her posture elegant, her eyes steady. Around her, rubble lies in heaps, but she walks as though on a boulevard, carrying with her the assurance that life will return. And in the distance, faint but insistent, comes the sound of hammers, of rebuilding, of a city refusing to die. The sound of hammers grew louder as London rose once more from its ashes, and with each strike against stone and timber, the war seemed to retreat into memory, though never far enough to vanish. The victory that so many had longed for brought joy, yet also a strange hollowness, for what had been endured could not simply be forgotten, and what lay ahead was no return to the old world, but the beginning of something entirely new. Diana, who had walked with poise through blackouts and rubble, now stepped into a city whose face was altered beyond recognition. The grandeur of the old aristocratic order, already faltering before the war, seemed now like a relic of a vanished age. The empire, too, trembled, its dominion fading, its certainties dissolving into air. In this shifting landscape, she, who had always lived between tradition and rebellion, once more found herself at a crossroads. The salons reopened, the lights returned to the theaters, the shops filled slowly again with goods, yet the atmosphere was not the same. The austerity of rationing lingered, the sorrow of loss still hung in the air, and though laughter returned, it was tempered by memory. Diana's gatherings, once filled with the careless chatter of youth, now bore the gravity of survival. Politicians spoke of reconstruction, writers of the need for renewal, artists of new forms born from ruin. And Diana, always attuned to the spirit of her age, listened, contributed, and reflected, her presence still magnetic, but now tinged with something quieter, more contemplative. For she, too, was altered. War had carved lines not only upon cities, but upon faces, and though her beauty remained luminous, it carried with it the depth of one who had endured. Admirers still flocked to her, drawn as ever to her elegance and wit, but now they sensed also the gravity beneath the charm. She was no longer the radiant rebel of midnight motor cars, nor merely the actress on a stage. She was a woman who had faced destruction and emerged intact, her rebellion tempered into resilience. And in this new age, her role shifted once more, from symbol of youthful defiance to emblem of continuity amidst change. Duff, too, carried his own transformation. His political career, once marked by speeches and controversy, now bore the weight of responsibility in a world that demanded adaptation. Together they navigated the changing tides, no longer young rebels but figures of influence and endurance. Their marriage, with all its complexities, remained intact, and in its survival there was a kind of victory as well. For just as London rebuilt itself from rubble, so too had their union withstood trials that might have undone others. Yet even as they adapted, they could not ignore the crumbling of the old order around them. The aristocracy to which Diana belonged was losing its hold. Great houses closed, estates sold, titles no longer carried the same authority. The war had democratized suffering, and with it came a democratization of life itself. Diana, who had never been content to be confined by her title, seemed almost to welcome this change. She had long seen the cracks in the facade of privilege. Now the facade itself was collapsing. Where others mourned the loss of grandeur, she simply moved forward, as she always had, into whatever new forms life offered. Her salons remained vibrant, but the company they kept was broader. No longer only the scions of dukes and earls, but also writers, journalists, thinkers, and figures from the expanding middle classes found their way into her drawing rooms. She, who had always bridged worlds, now widened her embrace still further. In conversation, she remained dazzling, her wit sharp, her laughter warm, her presence commanding. But she also listened more deeply, for she knew that the future belonged not to the echo of old names, but to new voices rising. The sense of transition touched her personally as well. She'd always been aware of her beauty, not vain but conscious, knowing its power and its burden. Now, as the years moved forward, she reflected on its fading, on the strange passage from being the admired object of gazes to being the respected presence of conversations. Some might have mourned the change. Diana accepted it with grace. For beauty, she knew, was not eternal, but spirit could be. And if her face no longer startled with youthful radiance, her spirit still shone, her intelligence still compelled, her independence still inspired. It is here, perhaps, that we glimpse the depth of her character most clearly. For rebellion in youth may be dazzling, but rebellion in age, rebellion against despair, against bitterness, against irrelevance, is rarer and more profound. Diana refused to retreat into nostalgia. She did not sigh for the days of the bright young things, nor lament the passing of aristocratic grandeur. Instead, she adapted, finding in each stage of life a new way to be free. Her refusal to be confined did not end with youth. It continued into maturity, reshaping itself with each change of the world around her. The city, too, mirrored her resilience. London rebuilt itself street by street, stone by stone, until once more it bustled with life. The scars of war remained visible, but they became part of the landscape, reminders of what had been endured. Diana, walking those streets, must have felt the kinship between herself and the city she loved, both scarred, both altered, both unbowed. Just as she had turned her beauty into resilience, so London turned its ruins into renewal. And yet, beneath the renewal, uncertainty remained. The empire shrank, new powers rose, the old certainties dissolved. Britain itself seemed unsure of its place in the world. In such times, Diana's role was not to lead armies or craft policies, but to embody continuity, to remind those around her that life could still be lived with elegance, with laughter, with grace. Her drawing rooms once again became havens where the turbulence of the age was momentarily suspended, where conversation and companionship provided a glimpse of stability amidst change. Picture her in these years, seated in a chair near a window, light falling across her face, her hands resting gracefully, her voice carrying through a room filled with guests. The air hums with debate, with laughter, with the smoke of cigarettes and the scent of wine. She listens, she responds, she teases, she challenges. Around her, the world outside is shifting, but within her rooms, the eternal rhythm of conversation continues. The rhythm she had always loved, the rhythm by which she had shaped her own form of influence. And yet, as the evening draws to a close, as the last guests depart and the house falls silent, she remains by the window a moment longer. Outside, the street lamps glow faintly, the rebuilt city rests, the air is heavy with both memory and possibility. She gazes into the night, aware that time is moving swiftly, that new generations are rising, that the world she once danced through in rebellion is now a world she observes with reflective eyes. The silence deepens, and in it lies both melancholy and peace. She lingered by the window as the city's lamps flickered outside, her gaze soft yet steady, and when she turned back to the room, she knew that silence could never be her only companion. The house that had fallen still with the departure of guests would fill again, as it always did, with voices and laughter, with the music of conversation that had long been her chosen art. For Diana's drawing rooms were not mere spaces of hospitality, but stages of influence, where words carried weight, where the exchange of ideas shaped the very fabric of the age. She had once stood upon theater stages, once danced in reckless rooms of the bright young things, but now it was her salon that became her truest theater, the place where her presence mattered most. The war had changed the world, and the gatherings of the post-war years were charged with urgency. No longer were they only for pleasure or for the indulgence of wit. They were forums where the great questions of a trembling century were laid bare. In her rooms, ministers spoke with writers, generals with painters, diplomats with poets. Here, the arts and politics intermingled, each sharpening the other, each finding in Diana a hostess who was not content with platitudes, but pressed for honesty. Her eyes, bright and amused, could disarm the pompous. Her questions, lightly asked, could reveal truths that official meetings often concealed. Those who entered her salon often remarked that it was not the grandeur of the rooms that lingered with them, nor the elegance of the table, but the way she animated the air itself. She had the gift of presence, the ability to draw others out of themselves, to make even the most reticent speak. And when they spoke, she listened, not with the polite nod of a hostess, but with genuine engagement, her responses quick, her laughter sudden, her insight sharp. To be heard by her was to feel one's words mattered. To be challenged by her was to feel one's ideas tested in fire. She did not seek to dominate, but to orchestrate. Conversation in her rooms was like music, each voice an instrument, each theme a melody, and she, without seeming to conduct, guided the rhythm, ensuring that harmony prevailed even amidst discord. A sharp remark here, a gentle nudge there, a burst of laughter to dissolve tension. These were her tools, and with them she shaped evenings that lingered in memory long after the last glass was emptied. And yet, influence was not her declared aim. She did not set out to mold policy or to direct thought, yet influence occurred naturally, because she embodied the qualities that politicians and artists alike sought: clarity, candor, courage. To speak before Diana was to risk being unmasked. To converse with her was to feel one's ideas refined. In this way, her salons became more than social events. They became crucibles where thought and strategy mingled, where the boundaries between public and private blurred. Evelyn Waugh, who never ceased to regard her as muse, once remarked that her conversation had a rare quality: the ability to make the listener feel not only entertained, but enlarged. He was not alone. Churchill himself, in quieter moments, was said to enjoy her presence not only for her charm, but for her clear-eyed view of the world. She could soothe egos without flattery, challenge ideas without hostility, and above all remind those who carried the weight of power that life was more than calculation. It was also laughter, beauty, and the resilience of spirit. Her salon was also a place of refuge. In an age when public life was fraught with scrutiny, when newspapers carried every rumor and Parliament echoed with contention, Diana's drawing rooms offered a space where words could flow more freely. Within her walls, men and women felt they could speak without pretense, that they could be more than their offices, more than their reputations. It was here that some of the most candid exchanges of the age occurred, spoken not across negotiating tables, but across her supper table, softened by wine and illuminated by her wit. Yet she was not merely a facilitator. She was herself a participant, never afraid to stake her view. On matters of culture, she was bold. On matters of politics, she was incisive. And always she spoke with independence. She did not echo Duff, nor defer to the great men of her circle. She was her own voice, and it was for this voice, as much as for her beauty or her charm, that people sought her company. But even as she created spaces of influence, she did not allow herself to be consumed by gravity. She knew that too much seriousness could stifle as surely as too much frivolity. Thus, her salons carried both weight and lightness, earnest debate followed by bursts of laughter, reflections on policy interrupted by stories of delight. She preserved always the human element, for she understood that influence is not born of solemnity alone, but of connection, of the bonds between people forged in shared joy as much as in shared struggle. Imagine such an evening. The fire crackling softly in the hearth, the air alive with smoke and voices, glasses glinting in the lamplight. A minister speaks heatedly of policy. Diana interrupts with a teasing remark that dissolves the tension into laughter. A writer recites a fragment of poetry. She listens with rapt attention, then comments with a depth that surprises him. A young guest, nervous and overshadowed, finds himself drawn into conversation by her encouragement, his voice gaining strength as she listens. The evening stretches late, but no one wishes to leave, for to depart is to step back into the ordinary, while here, in her rooms, life feels larger, richer, more alive. And when at last the last guest departs, she remains once more by the window, gazing into the night. The city lies quiet, but in her mind the echoes of voices linger. She has not delivered speeches nor drafted policies, yet she knows that what occurred in her rooms will ripple outward, shaping thoughts, softening hard edges, planting seeds. Influence, she understands, is not always loud. Sometimes it is carried in laughter, in a remark remembered, in the memory of a presence that cannot be forgotten. Her rebellion, once enacted in champagne-soaked nights, now took this quieter form. She no longer shocked with wildness, nor defied openly with scandal. Instead, she defied irrelevance, defied silence, defied the expectation that a woman of her station and age should fade into background. She remained at the center, not because she demanded it, but because she gave so much of herself that others could not help but be drawn to her. And so the image remains. Diana seated at her table, her eyes alight, her laughter rising, her questions probing. Around her the air is alive, the city beyond her walls uncertain, the century unsettled. But within her rooms there is a sense of continuity, of resilience, of life lived not as duty but as art. The night deepens, the lamps burn low, and as silence slowly returns, she leans back, her gaze once more drifting to the window, where the faint outline of dawn promises another day of voices, of presence, of influence. The dawn that crept beyond the window after her salons did not banish the voices that had filled the room, for many of those voices belonged to figures whose names echoed far beyond her drawing walls. To know Diana was not only to attend a gathering, but to encounter one of the great muses of her age, a woman whose friendships with the giants of politics and letters shaped not only their lives, but also her own. She had always lived in proximity to brilliance, yet in these later years she found herself not merely adjacent but entwined, her name inseparable from theirs, her influence woven into the fabric of their creations. Winston Churchill was among those who admired her deeply. His presence, already monumental, filled any space he entered, yet in Diana's rooms even he seemed more human, more open, more willing to laugh. She had known him through Duff's career, and over years of dinners and conversations, she earned his respect not through deference but through candor. She listened to his booming rhetoric, his sweeping visions, and she answered with wit that cut through the grandeur to the heart. He admired her elegance, but more than that, he admired her courage, her independence of thought, and perhaps he also recognized in her a kindred resilience, for both had faced criticism, endured isolation, and returned with greater force. Their friendship, though never formalized in history's documents, left its mark in the warmth of their exchanges, in the trust that allowed him to be less a statesman and more a man in her company. If Churchill admired her for her clarity, Evelyn Waugh adored her for her mystery. For Waugh, Diana was not merely a friend, but a muse, a figure whose beauty and spirit haunted his imagination. She appeared in his novels transfigured, her essence refracted through characters who bore her light and her shadow. He saw in her not only the luminous socialite, but also the deeper, more elusive woman who lived between worlds, never wholly of one nor the other. In his satire, sharp and merciless toward others, there lingered always a tenderness when she entered, a recognition that she represented something rare, the fusion of elegance and rebellion, of tradition and defiance. Diana, for her part, treated Waugh with affection and amusement, indulging his intensity while never losing her own independence. She understood that to be someone's muse is not to be captured, but to remain just beyond reach. And in this she excelled, for she inspired without ever allowing herself to be defined by another's vision. Other writers, too, found in her a source of fascination. Hilaire Belloc admired her, Osbert Sitwell included her in his circle, and poets found in her presence a reminder that life could indeed be art. Painters sought her likeness, eager to capture in line and color what words only suggested. Yet even as she allowed herself to be painted, described, imagined, she never surrendered the core of herself. Each portrait, each character, each recollection revealed something of her, but never the whole. She gave generously of her image while keeping her essence free. Perhaps this was her greatest artistry, to inspire creation without becoming consumed by it. Her friendships were not limited to the arts alone. Politicians, diplomats, soldiers, those who shaped the course of nations, sought her company. Some came for influence, others for solace, many simply for the joy of being in her presence. She was never afraid to speak with them as equals, never overawed by their titles or offices. Her gaze leveled them, her questions pierced them, her laughter reminded them that even in the gravest of matters, humanity must not be lost. In this way, she exercised a subtle power, not by commanding, but by reminding, not by dictating, but by humanizing. And yet these friendships were not merely about influence or inspiration. They were about connection. Diana, for all her brilliance, was not immune to loneliness, not untouched by the sorrows of love and life. In her friendships, she found companionship that soothed her, that reminded her she was not alone in her searching. She gave herself generously to those she cared for, and they, in turn, gave back, whether through affection, admiration, or the immortality of art. There's a curious balance in her relationships with great men. With Churchill, she was companion and confidant. With Waugh, she was muse. With Duff, she was partner and forgiver. With many others, she was interlocutor, spark, presence. Yet in all, she remained herself, never subsumed, never reduced to a mere appendage. She refused to be only the reflection of another's greatness. Instead, she stood as her own flame, her own center, around which others gathered. It is said that true greatness is not only in deeds, but in the ability to inspire deeds in others. By this measure, Diana's greatness is clear, for in her company, men of letters wrote more deeply, men of politics thought more clearly, men of war remembered their humanity. She drew from them their best selves, not by demand, but by presence, and in return they ensured that her spirit would echo through their works, preserved in characters, in portraits, in recollections that keep her alive even now. Imagine her, then, in a gathering where Churchill sits smoking, his voice rumbling through anecdotes of battles and debates, while Evelyn Waugh sits nearby, observing with sharp eyes, already shaping in his mind the satirical sketch he will later write. Diana sits between them, her head tilted, her smile quick, her words bridging the gulf between statesman and satirist. She listens, she interrupts, she teases, and in her light the gravity of one and the cynicism of the other soften. Around them others join in, the room alive with currents of wit and weight, and through it all, she remains the axis, the quiet center, the flame that holds the gathering together. And when the evening ends, when the guests depart, when Churchill returns to his papers and Waugh to his manuscripts, Diana remains once more in the silence of her room. She is weary, perhaps, yet also filled with the echoes of conversation. She knows that she has been at the heart of something larger than herself, yet she also knows that her role is not to control, but to illuminate. She has given, as she always has, and tomorrow she will give again. The night deepens, the lamps burn low, and outside the city stirs. Within her, memory and presence blend, for she carries not only the admiration of friends, but also the knowledge that she has become, in some ineffable way, part of their creations. She is both herself and more than herself, both woman and myth, both Diana and the endless reflections of Diana in the eyes of others. And so we leave her here, at the center of a constellation of friendships, her spirit reflected in the works of others, her presence woven into history not by office or title, but by the sheer force of her being. The dawn that approaches will bring new days, new stages, new challenges. But for now the echo of voices lingers, and in the quiet she smiles, knowing that she has lived not only her own story, but also a part of the stories of giants. The voices of great men lingered in her memory, their words and laughter folded into the silence of her rooms. And yet beyond those conversations, another image awaited, one not of words, but of light. For Diana, who had once taken the stage as a daring act of rebellion, also stepped into the newer realm of the cinema, where her face was no longer confined to salons or theaters, but projected, vast and luminous, before strangers seated in the dark. To see oneself multiplied upon a screen is to encounter both power and estrangement. Power in the immensity of one's image, estrangement in the knowledge that one's likeness now belongs to an audience unseen, unchosen. Diana, whose beauty had always been both her gift and her burden, found in film both a new stage and a new form of captivity. The silent films in which she appeared captured her features with reverence, the camera lingering on the curve of her cheek, the arch of her brow, the brightness of her eyes. Audiences, accustomed to seeing her name in society columns, now saw her embodied as heroine, as vision, as figure of desire. They gasped, they admired, they wrote of her with fascination. And yet what did they see? Did they glimpse Diana, the restless spirit who had walked away from duty, who had defied society's expectations? Or did they see only Lady Diana Cooper, daughter of a duke, transformed into an icon of light, untouchable, unreal? The paradox of film is that it immortalizes even as it distances. On screen, Diana became eternal, frozen in gestures, her youth preserved in flickering shadows. But in life, she continued to change, to grow, to search. Did she look upon her own image in the darkened theater and feel pride, or did she feel the unease of being reduced once more to the very mask she had always resisted? Perhaps both, for she loved performance, the art of slipping into roles, the joy of creation. Yet she was wary always of being consumed by image, wary of being adored for surfaces while her depths remained unseen. Critics praised her presence, though some questioned her skill, as they had upon the stage. But for audiences, the question of talent mattered less than the experience of seeing her, radiant and commanding, filling the screen. In those years of cinema's infancy, when the moving image itself was still a marvel, Diana's beauty seemed perfectly suited to its demands. She was both aristocrat and rebel, goddess and woman, luminous in a way that seemed beyond ordinary flesh. People spoke of her face as though it had been sculpted for the lens, each angle catching light as if by design. And yet, even here, she could not escape the whispers of scandal. For some in her class, the idea of Lady Diana appearing in films was still unthinkable, a descent into vulgarity. The screen was for actresses of another sort, women who had clawed their way into fame, not for those born into privilege. That a duke's daughter should stand before cameras, should be gazed upon by strangers in dark halls, seemed a breach of propriety too great to ignore. But Diana, as always, met such criticism with serenity, even amusement. If they whispered, let them whisper. She had lived long enough to know that scandal fades, while the act of living authentically endures. Her film work did not last forever. She was never bound wholly to cinema, never surrendered her life entirely to its rhythms. It was a chapter, one among many, a form of expression she embraced for a time before moving on. But its legacy remained, for the images persisted. Long after the lights of salons had dimmed, long after voices had faded, the reels still turned, and there she was, radiant, defiant, immortal in the flicker of light. Perhaps she understood in some quiet moment that in film she had achieved a strange kind of permanence, one she neither sought nor rejected, but accepted as part of her story. There is something haunting in the thought of her image surviving decades beyond her laughter, her presence captured and replayed for eyes she would never meet. It is as though film itself conspired to preserve the very paradox she embodied, at once present and absent, intimate and unreachable, real and unreal. For those who knew her, the films were shadows compared to the living woman. For those who did not, they were revelations, glimpses of a spirit they could never otherwise touch. And yet, Diana never mistook film for truth. She knew that it was another mask, another performance, another frame. To her, the stage of life, the drawing rooms, the war shelters, the salons, was the truer arena. Cinema was play, but conversation was essence. Still, she allowed herself to step into its glow, knowing that every performance, whether on stage, on screen, or in society, was another facet of her rebellion against silence, against being reduced to duty alone. Imagine her then, seated quietly in a theater as her own face appeared before her, magnified and luminous. Around her, strangers watched with awe, whispering, gasping, admiring. She sat among them, half amused, half estranged, seeing herself and not herself, a woman and a vision, Diana and not Diana. Did she smile knowing that she had conquered yet another boundary, that she had once again defied expectation by stepping where she was told she must not go? Likely she did, for defiance was her constant companion. And when she left the theater, stepping back into the night air, she shed the screen as easily as she had donned it. For she knew that her truest role was not to be an image projected upon strangers, but to be herself, luminous in presence, in laughter, in the immediacy of life. Cinema preserved her, but it could never contain her. She was more than the flicker of light. She was the fire itself. The curtain of the cinema falls, the lights rise, the audience disperses, and Diana walks out once more into the city's streets. Around her, the hum of traffic, the murmur of conversations, the glow of lamps. She is no longer magnified but restored to her scale, moving among others as a woman of flesh and voice. Yet the echo of the screen lingers, the knowledge that somewhere in reels and archives, her younger self continues to move, eternally luminous. She carries this knowledge lightly, for she has already turned toward the next act of her life, one that will demand not performance, but reflection. For soon she will take up the pen, and in letters and memoirs she will seek to capture in words what no image can hold, the truth of memory, elusive, partial, shimmering like the glow of a half-forgotten evening. The screen fades, the ink awaits, and Diana, ever restless, ever searching, prepares to write her life into being. The cinema curtain fell, the lights rose, and the audience dispersed into the streets, leaving only the faint echo of admiration behind. Diana, stepping out into the night air, seemed to leave the screen behind her as easily as one leaves a discarded cloak. The flickering image had preserved her beauty, but it had not preserved her truth. And truth, elusive though it may be, began to press more heavily upon her with each passing year. For beauty fades, memory alters, and life, once lived, becomes mist unless it is caught and shaped. And so she turned, as many do in later years, to the written word. In letters, in memoirs and recollections that stretched across decades, she sought to capture in language what no portrait or film could wholly reveal, the texture of a life lived in rebellion and radiance. She had always been a letter writer, her correspondence lively, filled with wit and candor. Friends treasured her notes, not only for their charm, but for the sharpness of her observations. In her letters, she revealed more than she did in conversation, for the page allowed a depth of reflection that the salon, with its shifting voices and laughter, often disguised. She wrote quickly, vividly, her words flowing with the same energy that had always carried her through conversation. But in the stillness of writing, she allowed glimpses of weariness, of longing, of the shadows behind her laughter. In time, she gathered these threads into memoirs, books that told her story not as a historian might, with careful chronology, but as a woman recalling moments of light and shadow. She wrote of her childhood in Belvoir, of her mother's fire, of the echoes in the castle halls. She wrote of her youthful defiance, her years among the bright young things, the scandal and the joy of stepping upon the stage. She wrote of Duff, of their marriage, its brilliance and its pain, its fidelity of spirit despite its infidelities of body. She wrote of war, of shelters, of laughter ringing against the backdrop of destruction. Her prose, like her presence, was elegant but not solemn. She did not weigh her sentences with excessive gravity. She allowed them to flow, to shimmer, to reveal without insisting. Readers found in her memoirs not a careful record, but a voice, unmistakably hers, candid, witty, luminous. Some accused her of evasion, of leaving out truths too sharp to touch. But what memoir is complete? To write one's life is always to choose what to remember, what to forget, what to frame in light, what to leave in shadow. Diana understood this, and she made her choices. And yet, in the spaces between her words, one can sense the unspoken. She spoke of beauty, but hinted at its burden. She recalled laughter, but allowed glimpses of sorrow. She admitted uncertainty about her paternity, the whispers that had followed her since birth, but treated them with a lightness that left readers uncertain whether she was wounded or simply amused. She wrote of Duff's wanderings, but always returned to the constancy of their bond. In every memory, ambiguity lingered, as though she wished not to settle the matter, but to let readers feel the same shimmering uncertainty that she herself had lived. To write is to attempt permanence, but Diana knew that permanence is illusion. Memory is not a vault, but a shifting tide, and the self who writes is not the self who lived. Perhaps that is why her memoirs feel less like monuments than like conversations, intimate, fluid, unfinished. They invite the reader not to witness a definitive account, but to share in the act of remembering, with all its distortions and doubts. In this way, she continued the spirit of her salons. Her books are gatherings of memory, where the reader is guest, participant, listener. For her, the act of writing was not only for others, but for herself. To shape her memories was to make sense of them, to reconcile the contradictions that had defined her. Aristocrat and rebel, actress and hostess, muse and woman, admired and alone. Each sentence was a way of stitching together fragments, of finding coherence in a life that had often seemed to resist it. And in this, perhaps, she found a measure of peace. Readers responded with admiration. They recognized in her voice the same qualities that had long captivated in person: wit, candor, elegance, independence. They admired her honesty, though they also sensed her evasions. But even the evasions were telling, for they revealed what she could not, or would not, expose. Some praised her courage, others her charm. All acknowledged that her memoirs were more than mere recollections of a privileged life. They were meditations on the art of living freely. Imagine her at her desk, the lamp glowing softly, papers scattered, pen in hand. Outside, the city hums, but within the room there is quiet. She pauses, her gaze drifting as memory stirs, then bends again to write. Her handwriting flows across the page, elegant, deliberate, alive. She writes of a ballroom long gone, of laughter long faded, of a face glimpsed in youth. She smiles at the recollection, then sighs at another. The pages fill, and with them her life takes shape, not as history would record it, but as she herself chooses to remember. Yet even as she wrote, she must have wondered, what is truth in memory? What is fact when shaped by recollection, by desire, by the need to make sense of a life? Did she capture herself, or only an image of herself? Another mask, another performance, this time on the page. Perhaps she knew the answer was unimportant. For truth, like beauty, is not singular. It shimmers, it shifts, it reveals itself differently to each eye. And in writing, as in living, she embraced the ambiguity, refusing to be reduced to a single version of herself. And so her books joined the shelves, her letters filled drawers, her words traveled beyond her salons and her presence. Readers who had never seen her, never heard her voice, now encountered her through the intimacy of print. They laughed at her wit, admired her candor, felt the shadow of her sorrows. She, who had once lived as a vision to be looked upon, now became a voice to be heard. In this, perhaps, she achieved what she had always sought, to be seen not only as an image but as a mind, a spirit, a voice. The lamp at her desk flickers lower, the pen rests, the pages lie scattered. Outside, the night deepens, the silence grows. She sits back, weary but satisfied, knowing that in words she has left behind something of herself that cannot fade with beauty, that cannot be reduced to scandal, that cannot be silenced by time. She has written herself into memory, not perfectly, not completely, but truly in her own way. And beyond the desk, beyond the written pages, life continues to move. For soon she will face loss deeper than any she has yet written of, loss that no memory can soften. Duff, the partner of her life, with all his brilliance and betrayals, will pass, and in that absence her pen will falter, her voice will change. The memoirs will remain, but the silence left by love's end will become the truer text of her later years. The papers on her desk lay still, the ink drying into permanence. But even as words formed upon the page, life itself was preparing to write a harsher sentence than any she could compose. For Duff, her companion through decades of brilliance and betrayal, her partner in salons and embassies, her fellow traveler in politics and laughter, was nearing the end of his restless journey. His death, when it came in 1954, left Diana not only widowed, but profoundly altered, for the absence of the man she had chosen against all expectation and endured against all judgment reshaped the very rhythm of her days. The silence after his passing was unlike any she had known. The house that once rang with his voice, quick and eloquent, seemed emptied of a vital current. The chair where he had sat lay vacant. The books he had handled gathered dust. The air itself seemed thinner. Diana, who had endured the loneliness of his wanderings in life, now confronted the deeper loneliness of his eternal absence. She had forgiven infidelities, had borne wounds with grace, had laughed even when tears might have come more easily, but this loss admitted no defiance. Death was the one scandal from which no wit could rescue her, the one absence her laughter could not disguise. And yet she did not collapse. Her resilience, tested through youth, through war, through marriage, sustained her still. She mourned, she wept, she felt the depth of her grief, but she also endured. In her letters and memoirs of this time, there is sorrow, but not despair. She spoke of Duff with tenderness, acknowledging his flaws, admitting the pain, but always returning to love. "He was unfaithful, but he never ceased to love me," she wrote, capturing in that paradox the essence of their marriage. It was not perfect, it was not simple, but it was theirs, and in its complexity lay its truth. Friends rallied around her, offering comfort, yet many wondered how she bore the weight with such calm. Perhaps it was because she had long lived in awareness of his impermanence. His infidelities had been rehearsals in absence, small foretellings of the final absence to come. She had lived alongside loss even when he lived, and so, when the great loss came, she was not unprepared. But preparation does not soften the blow, it only allows one to survive it. And survive she did, carrying his memory into her later years as a companion invisible yet constant. Her grief reshaped her surroundings. The rooms they had shared now bore his ghost. The garden, once walked together, now carried only her solitary steps. At dinners and gatherings, his absence was felt as sharply as his presence had once been. Yet she continued to host, to laugh, to engage. She did not retreat into widowhood as some might have expected, cloaking herself in mourning and silence. Instead, she honored him by continuing the life they had built, by keeping alive the rhythm of conversation, the spark of wit, the light of presence. In this, her rebellion persisted. She refused to let death silence what life had created. And yet, when the guests departed, when the lights dimmed, the solitude returned. In those hours she wrote more than ever, pouring into letters and memoirs the reflections that conversation could not hold. Writing became not only a record, but a solace, a way of speaking to the absence. Each sentence carried his shadow, each page a dialogue with the unseen. In this way she kept him alive, not in denial, but in memory. The paradox of her widowhood was that it deepened her independence even as it revealed her loneliness. She had always been fiercely herself, unwilling to be defined by duty or expectation. But now, without Duff, her selfhood was tested anew. Who was she apart from him? A rebel still, yes, a hostess, a writer, a presence. Yet the mirror reflected differently, for half of the dance was gone. She moved with grace, but always with the awareness of absence at her side. Friends observed that she carried her widowhood with dignity, that she did not burden others with grief, that she remained luminous even in sorrow. But beneath the surface, the weight was heavy. She once wrote of the emptiness of returning to an empty house, of the silence that greeted her where once a voice had called. In such moments, beauty and wit offered no shield. Only endurance remained, the quiet endurance that had sustained her from childhood halls to wartime shelters, and now sustained her in the solitude of loss. Yet she did not let grief diminish her role in the world. She continued to receive, to converse, to write, to live. Her presence, though touched with melancholy, remained vital. She spoke of Duff with affection, never bitterness, ensuring that his memory lived not as wound but as story. In this, too, she revealed her strength, for to remember without rancor is rare, to honor without idealizing, rarer still. She knew him in his wholeness, brilliant, faithless, loving, and she loved him still. Imagine her in these years, seated once more at her desk, pen in hand, the lamplight casting a soft glow, the house around her quiet. She pauses, her gaze drifting to the empty chair that once held him. She sighs, perhaps smiles faintly, and bends again to write, her words flowing as though in conversation with the absent. The page fills, not only with memory but with presence, for in writing she feels him near, as though her words might bridge the distance between life and death. Her widowhood did not erase her rebellion, it transformed it. She no longer defied only society's expectations, but also despair itself. To live after loss, to continue with grace, to laugh still, to welcome still, to write still. This became her rebellion, and in this rebellion she revealed the deepest truth of her spirit. That freedom is not only in defying duty, not only in refusing roles, but also in choosing life when life wounds most. The years moved forward, carrying her into an elderhood she had once scarcely imagined. Her salons changed in character, her writing deepened in reflection, her beauty softened into presence. She was no longer the dazzling rebel of youth, nor the actress upon the stage, nor the diplomat's wife hosting embassies. She was now something rarer, a woman who had lived fully, who had endured loss without surrender, who had turned even widowhood into a form of luminous independence. And yet the image remains of the empty chair, the garden walked alone, the silence of rooms once filled. Loss does not vanish, it becomes part of the air one breathes. Diana breathed it daily, but she did not let it suffocate her. Instead, she carried it with dignity, weaving it into her laughter, her writing, her presence, until it became not only sorrow, but also strength. The empty chair remained in its place. The rooms bore the weight of memory, Yet Diana did not fade into shadow. She moved onward step by step into a new chapter of life, one where she no longer played the role of dazzling young rebel, nor of diplomat's wife at the height of war, but of grande dame, the elder spirit of a changing society. With Duff gone, she might have withdrawn entirely, retreating into solitude, but instead she carried herself forward with the same poise that had marked her through every transformation. Those who encountered her in these later years found not a relic of the past, but a presence still luminous, still sharp of wit, still capable of filling a room with her spirit. She aged with grace, though she did not deny the passage of time. Her beauty, once described in rapturous terms, softened, but the charm that had always been her truer gift endured. Where youth had dazzled with radiance, age now compelled with depth. Friends and visitors spoke of her eyes, which retained their brightness, their mischief, their capacity to see directly into another's thought. She could no longer dance through the night nor act upon stages, but she could command a conversation, she could shape an evening, she could remind those younger than her that rebellion was not only the province of youth, but could be carried with dignity into old age. Society in the decades after the war changed beyond recognition. The aristocracy diminished further, the empire retreated, the 60s brought new voices, new rebellions, new styles. Young people filled the streets with music, with protest, with color that defied the gray solemnity of their elders. Diana, who had once been a bright young thing herself, watched these new generations with curiosity. Some contemporaries dismissed the youth as wild or careless, but Diana, though amused, did not condemn. She recognized in them the same restless energy that had driven her own generation to scandalous parties and reckless laughter. They too are rebelling, one can imagine her thinking, only in their own fashion, only against the walls they find around them. In this way, she remained relevant, not by imitating the new, but by recognizing its kinship with her own past. Younger figures sought her out, drawn by her reputation, intrigued by her presence. They found in her not a scolding elder, but a woman who understood the necessity of rebellion, who admired courage even when expressed in ways different from her own. In her conversations with them, she bridged generations, offering perspective without condemnation, memory without bitterness. Her salons in these years took on a quieter tone. The glamour was still there, the elegance of setting, the hum of conversation, but the pace slowed. Guests were often younger, writers and thinkers who looked to her for guidance as much as for companionship. She listened with patience, offered her wit sparingly but precisely, and always carried with her the aura of one who had lived fully. To sit with her was to feel connected to an earlier age, yet also to sense the continuity of spirit across decades. Widowhood, though softened by companionship and conversation, remained with her. She often spoke of Duff, recalled him with warmth, quoted his words, repeated his anecdotes. In doing so, she kept him alive not only for herself, but for others, ensuring that his presence remained part of her gatherings. Yet she did not live only in the past. She did not retreat into memory as some widows do, but remained engaged with the present, curious about the world around her. Newspapers, books, letters. She absorbed them all, eager still to know what was unfolding, unwilling to let life pass her by. There is a dignity in age that comes not from solemnity, but from authenticity, and Diana embodied it. She did not pretend youth, nor deny its passing. She embraced age as another stage, another role, another form of being. She dressed elegantly still, though more simply. She carried herself with poise, though her steps slowed. She spoke with authority, though her voice softened. Her rebellion was no longer loud, but it endured, for she refused to let age silence her, refused to vanish into invisibility. Imagine her in these later years, seated by a fire, the room lit warmly, friends gathered in chairs around her. The conversation is gentle, reflective. Someone asks about the bright young things, about those glittering nights of the 20s. She smiles, her eyes alight with memory, and tells a story, her words carrying the laughter and the poignancy of those long-ago days. The room listens, spellbound, not only because of what she says, but because of how she says it. Her voice filled with both delight and distance, aware of the absurdities of youth but tender toward them. In that moment, she is both participant and witness, both the young woman she once was and the elder who recalls her. Yet solitude deepened too. For all her gatherings, for all her friendships, nights alone grew longer, the house quieter. She endured it with resilience, but she felt it. The laughter of the past was irreplaceable, the presence of Duff irreplaceable. Still, she chose to live with openness rather than retreat into melancholy. Her letters of this time reveal both weariness and gratitude, both sorrow and serenity. She accepted life as it was, even when it was tinged with loneliness. In her elder years, she became a kind of symbol, admired not only for what she had done, but for how she carried herself. She embodied continuity with the past, yet also defiance of it, a paradox that had always defined her. She was the rebel aristocrat still, though now her rebellion was quieter, against invisibility, against despair, against the notion that age must mean decline. She lived with presence to the very end, reminding all who knew her that life, at any stage, could be luminous. And so the image remains. Diana, a grand old lady of society, seated in her chair, her face lined but beautiful, her eyes mischievous, her spirit unbowed. Around her, younger voices speak of new worlds, new struggles, new freedoms, and she listens, smiling, recognizing in them the eternal cycle of rebellion. Outside, the world shifts restlessly, but within her presence there is calm, the calm of one who has lived fully, who has endured much, who has refused always to be confined. The fire burns low, the conversation fades, the night deepens. She sits a while longer, gazing into the embers, remembering faces now gone, feeling the weight of time but not crushed by it. For even in solitude she remains herself, luminous, unconfined, alive. The fire crackled softly as the last embers glowed, and in their fading light, Diana found herself gazing not only backward toward her own remembered rebellions, but outward, toward the voices of a new age rising beyond her window. For the world had changed again, as it always does, and the quiet dignity of her elder years was set against the fierce noise of the 1960s and 70s. She, who had once danced recklessly through nights of laughter and scandal, now watched a younger generation fill the streets with protest songs, fill the air with music that throbbed like a heartbeat, fill the world with colors and cries that startled their elders. What did she make of them? These heirs to rebellion, these children who seemed to burn with the same fever that had once carried her own companions into midnight motor cars and champagne-soaked escapades. She was not one to scorn. Others of her circle dismissed the youth, muttering of vulgarity, of noise, of decline. But Diana, though amused, did not condemn. She recognized in their long hair and loud guitars, in their marches and their slogans, the echo of her own youth, though expressed differently. When she saw young women insisting on their freedom, men refusing to bow to the rituals of duty, artists breaking with tradition, she must have felt a kinship. For had she not once shocked her elders with cigarettes and laughter, with acting upon a stage, with marrying not as instructed but as she chose? Rebellion wears many costumes, but the spirit is the same. She watched with curiosity as London itself transformed. The city of her salons, of her wartime endurance, now pulsed with new rhythms. Carnaby Street's fashions, psychedelic posters, gatherings in Hyde Park, all seemed to announce that the world of restraint was gone. Yet beneath her amusement, there was also reflection. Was it the same rebellion? Did these young ones seek freedom as she had, or were they chasing merely novelty? Did their cries carry the same depth, the same defiance, or had rebellion become spectacle? These questions lingered in her thoughts, not answered but allowed to breathe, for Diana did not deal in easy conclusions. Visitors of the younger generation still came to her, intrigued by her legend, curious about her presence. They found in her not a scolding relic of the past, but a woman who listened with openness, who offered memory not as condemnation but as perspective. She told them of nights in the 20s, of laughter and scandal, of how her generation too had been called wild and frivolous. They listened, surprised that she, the grand elder, understood their hunger to overturn what seemed stale. And in her stories they found validation, for she reminded them that rebellion is never new, only renewed, and that each generation must find its own way of defying what it inherits. Yet she also cautioned, though gently. She knew from experience that rebellion burns brightly, but not endlessly. The bright young things had laughed in the shadow of war, had danced in the face of collapse, but their revelry had not prevented the next storm. The youth of the 60s too laughed, too danced, too protested, and Diana, with her long gaze, wondered what storms awaited them, what shadows would temper their fire. She did not lecture, but her presence itself, seasoned by memory, reminded them that rebellion is precious, but also fragile. The joy must always be balanced with endurance. Her own role in these years became one of witness. She was no longer at the center of the whirl, no longer the flame around which others circled, but the observer who saw both past and present at once. This gave her a rare serenity, for she knew the patterns of life, knew that each age believes itself unique, yet each carries the same longing, to be free, to be alive, to refuse the confines of duty. And so she watched with a half-smile, half-sigh, at once amused and tender, knowing that the fire of youth must burn, even if it leaves ashes behind. She also reflected upon her own rebellion in contrast. Where once she had shocked by acting on stage, now the stage was filled with countless women, free to choose careers once barred. Where once she had been whispered about for her defiance of marriage expectations, now divorce and independence no longer carried such scandal. In a sense, the world had caught up with her, and she lived long enough to see her own choices echoed in the freedoms others now claimed. Did she feel satisfaction? Perhaps. But she also felt the strangeness of being both rebel and ancestor, both the one who had broken boundaries and the one whose broken boundaries had become ordinary. Imagine her in these years, seated again by her fire, visitors around her, some young, some old. A young woman speaks passionately of equality, of freedom, of the right to live without chains. Diana listens, nods, smiles faintly, then replies with a story of her youth, of how she too had felt the sting of chains and the thrill of breaking them. The room laughs, reflects, draws connections across decades. In that moment, time folds, and rebellion itself is revealed as timeless, passed from one generation to another like a torch, burning differently but burning still. Yet solitude deepened also, as it must in later years. Friends of her own generation passed away one by one until the gatherings of youth existed only in memory. She carried them with her, those bright faces of the 20s, those voices that had once filled rooms with laughter. She remembered them tenderly, not with bitterness, but with the wistfulness of one who knows that no moment can be repeated. Their rebellion had been theirs, their laughter theirs, and though new generations danced anew, those particular voices were silent forever. In this silence, Diana's own endurance took on a new quality, less exuberant, more contemplative. Still, she endured not with sadness alone, but with humor. Age did not strip her of mischief. Visitors often remarked that her wit remained intact, that she could still puncture pretension with a remark, still laugh with the delight of youth. Her spirit, though softened, was not extinguished. She had always refused to be confined, and she refused now to be confined by age, by loss, by solitude. Even as her body slowed, her presence remained vital. Her rebellion continued in the simple act of remaining luminous when others expected her to fade. And so the image endures. Diana, an elder now, sitting in her chair, her eyes still bright, listening to the new music of youth drifting faintly through the city streets, remembering her own wild nights and smiling at the eternal cycle of rebellion. Outside, the world turns, voices rise, colors shift, the young claim their freedom as fiercely as she once had. Inside, she witnesses, she remembers, she affirms. The torch has passed, but she, the old rebel, still watches its flame. The fire burns low, the visitors depart, the house falls quiet once more. She leans back, gazing into the embers, her thoughts turning inward. What is rebellion, she wonders? Momentary spark or enduring flame? Did her life prove that freedom can be lasting, or only that each age must light its own fire anew? The embers crackle softly, refusing an answer, offering only their glow. The embers glowed faintly, whispering their slow descent into ash, and in their fading light, Diana's thoughts turned toward the two forces that had followed her since youth: beauty and fame. They had been companions as inseparable as shadow and flame, guiding her, burdening her, defining her in the eyes of others, even when she sought to define herself otherwise. Now, in the quiet of her elder years, she considered them differently, no longer with the amused defiance of youth, but with the contemplative patience of age. For what is beauty when the bloom has softened, when the face admired in salons and on screens is lined with years? And what is fame when the voices that once pronounced it fade, when new names rise to take the world's attention? Her beauty had been legendary. Writers compared her to angels. Artists longed to capture her likeness. Critics described her presence as arresting. Even other women spoke of her glow with awe. She had never denied it, never feigned ignorance of the power it granted her, but she had always carried it lightly, with a hint of distance, as though beauty were not truly hers but a mask she wore. In youth, she had sensed the danger of being seen only for it, of being loved for surfaces while her depths remained hidden. She had rebelled precisely because she knew beauty's double edge. It opened doors, but it also confined. Now, in age, she looked in the mirror and saw a face transformed. The radiance of youth was gone, replaced by the lines of laughter, of sorrow, of endurance. Some would have mourned this loss, but Diana did not. She smiled at her reflection, amused at the irony that those who once adored her features would scarcely recognize them now. Beauty fades, she knew, but spirit endures. And in her spirit she still felt luminous, still capable of drawing others, not by the perfection of her face, but by the light in her presence. Visitors still spoke of her charm, still admired the way she filled a room, still found themselves disarmed by her wit. This, she realized, was the truer gift, not beauty of surface, but beauty of being, the ability to make others feel more alive in her company. If her youth had dazzled, her elderhood inspired. She was no longer the untouchable goddess, but the wise rebel, her lines worn proudly, her laughter enriched by memory. In this she found a new freedom, for she was no longer imprisoned by the gaze. She had outlived the tyranny of admiration and now lived in the liberty of authenticity. Fame, too, had altered. Once, newspapers chronicled her presence at every party, her name carried in whispers and headlines alike. She had been the subject of endless fascination, the emblem of a generation's wildness. On screen, her face had been magnified into legend. But fame is fickle, always shifting, always seeking the next. By the 60s and 70s, other names filled the columns, other faces filled the screens. She was remembered, yes, admired still, but no longer the center of gossip or scandal. Some might have felt diminished by this, but Diana felt released. Fame had been another mask, another cage, and she was glad to set it down, to be remembered not as the star of the moment, but as the enduring spirit of a past age. This suited her. She reflected on the strange endurance of reputation. For though the newspapers no longer trailed her steps, her legend persisted in subtler ways. Writers still invoked her name, artists still recalled her presence, younger people still sought her out with curiosity about the bright young things, about her rebellion, about her luminous life. Fame, she realized, is not the clamor of headlines, but the whisper of memory, the way a name lingers in the imagination of others. And in that sense, she remained famous, though differently. Not as spectacle, but as myth. She thought often of her younger self, the girl wandering Belvoir's corridors, the young woman standing beneath the stars after a ball, the actress stepping onto a stage, the hostess filling her rooms with brilliance. Were those selves still hers, or had they become fictions, half-true memories embellished by repetition? Beauty and fame had made her both herself and something more than herself, a vision for others to project upon. Now, in the quiet, she wondered, had she ever truly been seen, or had she always been partly imagined? Perhaps the answer was both. She had been seen by some, Duff in his way, Evelyn Waugh in his worship, friends who loved her laughter, but she had also been imagined, endlessly refracted through art, gossip, memory, and yet she did not resent this. To inspire imagination is itself a form of living beyond oneself. She had been more than one person, more than one image, and perhaps that was freedom too. There is a tender image of her in these years. Diana seated before a mirror, her hair silver now, her gown simple, her face lined yet luminous. She looks at herself, smiles faintly, shakes her head at the thought of those who once worshipped this reflection. She knows the vanity of beauty, the futility of fame, but also their power, their strange necessity. She does not despise them. She accepts them as companions who had traveled with her, companions now quieter but still present in memory. She also thought of the young who still chased these companions, who adorned themselves, who longed for headlines, who sought the gaze of the world. She did not judge them, for she had done the same, but she knew what they did not yet, that beauty fades, fame shifts, but spirit remains. Perhaps she wished she could whisper this truth to them, but she also knew they would not listen. Youth never listens. It must learn by living. So she let them chase and smiled with tender amusement. In her letters, she wrote of these reflections, sometimes with candor, sometimes with mischief. She joked about her faded looks, teased herself, but always with grace. For she had never clung desperately to her image. She had always been more than her face, more than her fame. And now, in age, she revealed the deeper beauty of one who has lived fully, rebelled joyfully, endured faithfully. The fire burned low, the embers turned to ash, and she sat quietly, her reflection in the glass faint in the dim light. Beauty and fame had been her companions, but now they seemed like distant figures waving from the far shore. She smiled at them, grateful, amused, unburdened, for she knew that what endured was not the glow of her face nor the clamor of her name, but the light of her spirit, which had refused always to be confined. and outside, as dawn touched the sky, the voices of youth rose again, new songs, new fashions, new rebellions. Diana listened faintly, her smile deepening. Let them dance, let them chase, let them believe their flame eternal. She had been them once. Now she was the witness, the elder, the reminder that beauty and fame are only masks, but life itself, the refusal to be confined, is the true fire that endures. The mirror dimmed in the half-light of dawn, her reflection softened to shadow, and with each passing year, Diana felt herself turning gradually from presence into memory, as though the world around her had begun to see her less as a woman among them and more as a figure of history still alive. It was a curious transition, one that she both accepted and resisted, for she had always rebelled against confinement, and to be placed upon the shelf of myth while yet breathing was its own kind of confinement. Yet she also knew that such transformation was inevitable, for her life had never belonged only to herself. From the moment whispers surrounded her birth, through her dazzling youth, her scandalous choices, her luminous salons, her presence on stage and screen, she had been woven into the story of her age. Now, in her final decades, she became the living echo of that story, the keeper of a flame that had once burned brightly and now flickered more gently, but still burned. Friends and visitors spoke of her with reverence, sometimes even awe, as though they had come to sit with history itself. Younger guests approached her with curiosity, asking of the bright young things, of Paris in the 20s, of wartime London. She answered with candor, with wit, with laughter, but always with the lightness that had defined her. She did not embellish excessively, nor did she dwell upon sorrow. She told her stories as one who knew their charm, but also their distance. It was another world, she might say, her eyes shining with both pride and wistfulness, and in that phrase was contained both the allure of memory and the ache of time. Her memoirs had already fixed certain versions of her story upon the page, but in conversation she remained freer, less bound by the demands of print. She could contradict herself, laugh at her own inconsistencies, admit what she had omitted before. In this way, she became not only a subject of history, but also its interpreter, shaping her own myth even as she lived it. Those who left her company carried away not only anecdotes, but impressions, the sense that they had touched, however briefly, a living flame of another era. Yet even as her legend grew, her days grew quieter. Age, though born with dignity, imposed its limits. She no longer hosted great salons as before. The gatherings were smaller, the evenings shorter, the circle narrower. Many of her contemporaries were gone, and she carried their memory within her as a private weight. The laughter of the 20s, the brilliance of wartime evenings, the sharp voices of Churchill and Waugh, all lived now only in her recollection. At times, solitude pressed heavily, but she bore it with the same resilience that had carried her through loss before. She did not complain, but endured, weaving even loneliness into her luminous presence. Fame, by then, had turned into legend. Articles spoke of her as a relic of another age, the last of the bright young things, the survivor of salons that had shaped culture. Portraits of her younger self circulated, photographs reproduced, her beauty admired once more, though now at a distance, as though she were a mythic figure rather than a living woman. She smiled at this, amused that the world preferred to remember her as a dazzling youth rather than to see her as the elder she had become. Yet she did not resent it. She accepted that myth has its own life, separate from the person. She allowed it to live, while she herself continued in quiet dignity. Her relationship with beauty changed yet again. No longer did she look in mirrors with irony. Now she scarcely looked at all. The world's fascination with her youthful image no longer touched her daily life. Those who visited saw her as she was, silver-haired, lined, luminous in presence, if not in face, and they found in her a deeper beauty, one not of features, but of spirit. For beauty of the face fades, but beauty of being, born of resilience, of independence, of wit, endures. In this way, she became more beautiful to those who truly saw her than she had ever been in youth. Letters still flowed from her pen, though more slowly, her hand less steady. Her words, however, retained their sharpness, their wit. She reflected on her past, on Duff, on friends gone, on the shifting world. She did not indulge in bitterness, though she could be sharp in judgment. She remained amused, reflective, alive to the contradictions of life. To the end, she refused to become solemn. Even in her elderhood, she laughed, and her laughter reminded those around her that the spirit of rebellion still glowed within. Imagine her in these years, seated by a window, the light of late afternoon upon her, a visitor listening as she recounts a memory. Her voice is soft now, but steady. But she speaks of a dance in the 20s, of a raid in wartime London, of Duff's quick words, of Waugh's sharp gaze. The visitor listens, entranced, aware that they are hearing not only a story, but a piece of living history. Diana smiles, her eyes distant, then laughs, dismissing her own recollection with a wave of the hand. It was long ago, she says, but the visitor knows that for a moment they have stepped into that long ago, carried by her words. And as the evening falls, as the visitor departs, she sits in the quiet once more, surrounded by memories that will soon outlive her. She knows that her life is passing into myth, that her presence will soon be memory only. She does not fear it. She has lived fully, rebelliously, luminously. To become myth is simply another transformation, another mask, another role in the great theater she has always embraced. She accepts it with grace, with laughter, with the same refusal to be confined that marked her every stage. The lamps glow, the night deepens, and Diana, luminous still, sits surrounded not by crowds, but by ghosts, companions of memory who will remain with her until the final curtain falls. Outside, the city continues, restless, indifferent, alive. Inside, she is at peace, her life turning quietly into legend. The lamps burned lower as the years drew her gently into twilight, and those who visited in her final seasons felt not only the presence of Diana the woman, but of Diana the legend, already half absorbed into memory even before her last breath. The world around her had changed almost beyond recognition. The great houses of her childhood had declined or closed. The empire of her youth had dissolved into history. The aristocracy to which she belonged had lost its grandeur. And yet she remained, luminous still, silver-haired and serene, the living thread that connected eras. By the time death approached, in the autumn of 1986, she had become not merely Lady Diana Cooper, but a figure suspended between past and present, a symbol of rebellion, beauty, resilience, and change. Her final years were quieter, marked less by salons and gatherings than by reflection. Friends who remained visited her, seeking not the glitter of parties, but the warmth of her conversation, the wit that age had not dulled, the presence that endured even as her body weakened. She spoke still of Duff, of her companions long gone, of the reckless joys of youth and the heavy sorrows of loss. She did not disguise her age, nor did she lament it. She accepted it as another transformation, another mask to wear lightly. She knew her time was near, and she prepared for it with the same grace that had marked her life. When death came, it was not with scandal nor spectacle, but with the hush of inevitability. She was 93. Her life stretched across nearly a century, her story spanning the grand halls of Belvoir, the champagne nights of the bright young things, the stages of theater, the flickering lights of cinema, the war shelters of London, the embassies of Paris, the quiet of widowhood. She had been many things, Duke's daughter, rebel, actress, hostess, muse, wife, widow, writer, but above all, she had been herself, refusing always to be confined to one role, one definition, one expectation. Her death closed a chapter not only of her own story, but of the centuries. In the days that followed, tributes were written, obituaries published, voices rose to recall her brilliance. Some remembered her beauty, unearthly and arresting, the face that had inspired artists and writers alike. Others recalled her wit, her independence, her refusal to be bound. Still others spoke of her endurance, her resilience in war, in marriage, in widowhood. She was praised as the last of the bright young things, as the muse of Waugh, as the loyal companion of Duff, as the luminous hostess of a vanished age. Each remembrance captured something of her, but none captured all, for Diana herself had always been more than the sum of others' words. Those who had known her intimately recalled the lightness of her presence, the way she made others feel alive in her company. They spoke not only of her public brilliance, but of her private tenderness, the letters written, the laughter shared, the silences endured. They knew her not as myth, but as friend, flawed and luminous, human, and yet somehow more. And in their recollections, the woman and the legend intertwined, inseparable at last. Her passing marked the end of an era, yet her spirit did not fade. For what remains of a life lived so rebelliously and radiantly? Not the beauty of youth which fades, not the fame of headlines which vanishes, not even the houses and salons which crumble. What remains is the light of example, the inspiration of courage, the memory of laughter. Diana's life whispered to those who came after, live freely, defy confinement, embrace both joy and sorrow, endure with grace. That message, though never declared as doctrine, lingers more powerfully than any speech or manifesto. She had begun in uncertainty, whispered about even in her paternity, her life marked from birth by doubt. She had grown into beauty that others sought to claim, into duty that others sought to impose. She had broken free step by step, by refusing to be defined, by choosing theater, by choosing Duff, by choosing rebellion over compliance. She had endured war, offering not only glamour but resilience. She had faced loss, carrying grief without surrender. She had aged without bitterness, laughed even when youth was gone, embraced elderhood as another role to perform with grace. And finally, she had accepted death itself as another transformation, another passage. Imagine her at the very end, lying quietly, her face softened, her breath faint. Around her, the silence is deep, the house hushed. Perhaps in those moments she saw again the castle corridors of her childhood, the laughter of her companions in wild youth, the face of Duff smiling, the rooms filled with conversation, the audiences gazing at her upon the stage, the smoke and laughter of salons, the rubble of war-torn London, the glow of embers in later years. Her life passing before her, not as a film but as a gathering of presences, a final salon of memory where all who had walked with her returned to bid her farewell. And when she was gone, what lingered was not silence, but echo. The echo of her laughter in stories retold, the echo of her beauty in photographs and films, the echo of her spirit in the words of those she inspired. She became not only Diana Cooper the woman, but Diana Cooper the myth, the rebel aristocrat, the luminous figure whose life stretched like a bridge across a century of change. The curtain falls at last, the stage darkens, the audience departs. Yet the memory of her performance lingers, not only in the applause of her time, but in the whispered recollections of those who came after. She is gone, yet she endures, in words, in images, in the imagination of history. And perhaps that is the truest immortality, not to live forever, but to inspire others to live more fully. The night deepens, the fire burns low, and the house grows still. Outside, the world continues, restless, unending. Inside, Diana rests, her story complete, her rebellion concluded, her spirit free. And we, remembering her, ask quietly, what does it mean to live unconfined, to carry beauty without vanity, fame without surrender, loss without despair? Perhaps her life does not answer, but only invites the question. And in that invitation she speaks still, across time, across silence, a voice luminous as ever,